on and off. And this mic on once you leave, because everyone else is going to be coming up here using this for their presentations. And if they're
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No? Is it on? There it is. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first of what we hope will be at least a few of these stakeholder engagement symposia from the Data Science Patient Value Program here at CU. My name is Matt Wynia. I'm the core lead for the engagement core at D2V, as we call it. And it's a real pleasure to have you here. I'm going to give a few words of introduction and background. We had some logistics running earlier, but I'll just reiterate a couple of those things and a couple of additional ones. This entire symposium is being broadcast through Zoom, which means everything needs to go through a microphone for people who are listening or watching remotely to know what's going on. So during Q&A, we'll have runners with microphones, and please just hold until you have a microphone in front of you before you start speaking. Same thing for the speakers. The room is not that large. You could speak in this room, and people in the back could hear you probably, but don't, because the people outside the room won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to do as I'm doing and sort of stand up and walk around, grab one of these if you're a speaker. Otherwise, the microphone at the podium is also on if you want to stand behind the podium. What were my other... we are in a special space here, and this is, in addition to being sort of a conference center, it is office space. And so if you go out into the atrium area during breaks and so on, if you wouldn't mind, we've been asked to just try to keep the noise level to a minimum when you're out in the atrium area. It is really nice to walk around the atrium. There's artworks, and it's a beautiful space. But just out of respect for the people who are trying to get other work done, try and keep it to a minimum when you're out there. This entire thing I mentioned is being broadcast with one exception. Facebook would not allow us to broadcast Dr. Baumer's talk. So we will have one talk today, if you're listening online, where things will suddenly go dead for about 15 minutes. And apologies for that, but those are the rules, and that's what we're talking about today, is what should be the rules. So it fits perfectly well with the theme of the conference. Let me start by just saying a couple words about the background of the data science program for those of you who are not already familiar with this. This is the slide that Kelly Burns, our awesome program manager, uses to describe how the Data Science to Patient Value program is supposed to wrap all of the big data available to us in an understanding of the values and the value that those data can hold for a variety of different stakeholders. So the Data Science Patient Value Program comes out of what was called a Dean's Transformation Grant. So it's a local grant, and it was designed to create transformative programs across the campus. There are 5 of these that were funded. One of them is this big data program. And I won't go into all the details because they're kind of gory details about how this actually came about. But I will say that what the purpose of the D2V program is to create a new environment for big data research, an environment in which we are well aware that the voices of multiple stakeholders must be involved in the development and implementation of research and implementation information, and that we are working with between the school, the researchers, and the hospitals. So Children's Hospital and the University Hospital are engaged in this work because this is really an innovations lab in the real world. The question for today is, why are we focused on stakeholder engagement? And I probably don't need to say a lot about this to people who are in this room, because you're here because you're interested in stakeholder engagement. But it's worth pointing out that the types of questions we're talking about, and I had a series of slides rotating before we got started of recent newspaper articles about these issues. And if it wasn't obvious to you, all of those articles are like the last week. The Times article is today. There's a big spread about the All of Us project at the National Institutes for Health. So this is complex work. It poses perhaps some novel challenges. And we are all going to need to get our hands around it, because even insofar as regular research has gone, we have plenty of examples of getting it wrong as regards stakeholder engagement. So, so learning how to do effective stakeholder engagement in this modern world with big data is important. It's also being demanded of us by a variety of different funders. So both PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and the NIH and ARC, all of these sort of major governmental funders are now requiring that stakeholders be engaged, and yet there's not a lot of guidance as exactly what comprises excellent stakeholder engagement. So, and I don't say this as a critique of PCORI, by the way. I think they're doing their level best to put out guidance on this, but there just is not a lot known about what are the most effective ways of engaging a variety of different stakeholders. And then third is that we also recognize, as this sort of innovations in the real world network, that if we want our research to actually make a difference in reality, we have to engage certain stakeholders, not just patients and communities, but we need to be able to engage the clinician community. We need to be able to engage the leadership of health systems. We need to be able to engage policymakers. So there are a variety of different stakeholders, and the methods that are effective and efficient for different stakeholders may be different. So the sort of big three questions that are asked as regards stakeholder engagement are, number one, who are we talking about? So PCORI has given their list of stakeholders, and I put them up here, but there are a variety of other people who do stakeholder engagement who have used different ways of categorizing the various stakeholders who might or might not be more or less engaged in the work of healthcare research. The next question is, why? What are you trying to get out of engaging stakeholders? So if you know that you want to engage patients, or you know you want to engage, really the prior question should be, what are you trying to get out of this engagement? And there are, again, PCORI has put out three sort of big buckets of areas where stakeholder engagement might be influential or might have something to offer. Planning a study, conducting a study, and disseminating the information from a study. But I have to say, those buckets are enormous, right? And within each of those buckets, there are a whole bunch of potential reasons why you might want to engage stakeholders. And this is a kind of famous quote from Goethe, but the bottom line, I think, with this is often you're going to go to where you are headed. Right? So if you don't know where you're headed, it's unclear what you're going to get out of it. And if you choose the wrong thing, or something that, you know, is not optimal, you're going to end up getting an answer to that, but not necessarily getting an answer to the other issue that you hadn't thought of up front. So thinking carefully about the why of engagement is important. And then finally, the reason we're here today, which is the how of stakeholder engagement. So what method are you going to use? This is the PCORI standard, methodology standard for stakeholder engagement. And I'll just leave it up here for a second to give you a chance to sort of soak in how little guidance this provides. Right? That's the standard. Use appropriate and necessary methods. And then they give you 5 examples of funded research that had good stakeholder engagement plans that you can look at as examples. And it's helpful, but not, really there. So as a public health kind of guy, this is what I would love to see. I'd love to have a graphic like this, and everyone probably recognizes this, right? So I've got 2 samples, they're drawn from a normal distribution, they're paired, so I'm gonna use paired t-test. Wouldn't it be great if we had something like that for stakeholder engagement methods? But we don't. We don't have anything like that that says, if you have this criterion and this criterion and this criterion, try using this method. So that has been the task of the D2V engagement core for the last year, is thinking about various types of stakeholder engagement methods. And there are a lot of different ways to categorize this. And it would be nice if, as my simple mind started out, thinking that, there will be 5 categories. It turns out that the categories look more like, this, with multiple dimensions and multiple ways in which you can categorize different features of engagement methodologies. And so we have turned to thinking about, okay, so there are a lot of different methods. How about let's look at platforms that can be used? And that's how we got here today, was by thinking about platforms that involve direct personal engagement in person, platforms that are traditional media, sort of one-way focused, and then what we're here to talk about today, which is the use basically of social media, of virtual platforms to engage stakeholders in healthcare research. There are a lot of reasons why people are interested in trying to use virtual platforms, but they can be summarized in this, which is they're efficient potentially, and they really dramatically reduce barriers to participation, at least for some audiences. But there is a big question about whether virtual platforms can create real, meaningful engagement, right? This is what I think most people think about the type of engagement that often occurs in the virtual environment. And there are a lot of reasons why the virtual environment can foster either echo chamber type dialogue or flame war type dialogue, neither of which is particularly productive. And among these many reasons is the fact that the people who engage in virtual platforms are not always the people that you want to talk to. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not, right? The person with the loudest megaphone, the person with the greatest thing, the largest number of things to say isn't always actually who you want in the room and engaging in your research. So, so to wrap up, why focus on stakeholder engagement with regard to virtual platforms? Well, virtual platforms can provide an effective means to address some of the mistrust issues, some of the input that people would like to have into how their data are being used. If we do it right, there is relatively little guidance, but there's also relatively little funding for doing engagement work. And virtual platforms are relatively inexpensive. So it would behoove us to learn how to use this relatively inexpensive, far-reaching set of tools effectively. And finally, I'm over 50. I don't automatically turn to virtual platforms for all of my interactions, but I am told by my kids that they don't really care what I think about their social media platform use. This is how they communicate. And so the reality of the world as we move forward is that communication is happening through these virtual platforms. And so figuring out how to make that communication productive and effective for improving democratic deliberative decision-making in our democratic community is a very important task for us. I will put up here the few ways in which I am involved in virtual platforms. So I have a Twitter account, and this is our live tweet. I just made this up right beforehand, but D2V 2018, if you want to hashtag that so that people can follow. I know the CU Anschutz PR people are following along on that. So please use that for live tweeting. And who am I turning this over to, Suzanne? I'm turning this over to Kimminau.
Thank you. I think I'm going to start out over here.
Do you know how to take notes on the side?
Then I am on my own. Good. Okay. Things are going great already.
Let me get that turned off. There you go.
Super. Well, now this sort of doesn't matter, but that's okay. Go ahead. Thanks. So I'm already clutching my way along as your starting speaker. My phone went off, and now I can't see my notes. So I am going to be just winging what I know already from my heart. We already talked about how stories are really what's important, and most of what I'm going to share with you are stories. So I'm going to talk about liberating structures. Anybody know what liberating structures are? Zero. Not anybody. I don't know if anyone else on Zoom has used it, but this underscores the fact that I think in our world of biomedical research, we're not necessarily on top of all engagement strategies and techniques. And so this was new to me. And I'm going to use the title here, A Stone Soup Approach. How many, I hope there's more than 0 hands. Everybody know the stone soup parable? The folk tale. I'm an anthropologist by training, so I love the history and folk legend that sometimes informs even today's world. The earliest history we have of stone soup is around 1720. And there are lots of different cultures, examples of stone soup, where travelers come to town and have nothing but a pot. They put a stone in it, heat it up, and convince everybody to donate something that's of value so that they all enjoy a hearty soup at the end of the day. Some could say that's trickery. Others would say it's collaborative work. I'd say it filled everyone's stomach in an egalitarian way. But I think a lot of what we do around engagement, stakeholder engagement broadly, so I'm not just talking patients and communities, I'm talking health systems and leadership within communities across the town square, requires a stone soup approach of techniques and technologies. So that's my theme for today. And I'll help by pointing out that I'm from Kansas. We live in an almost 82,000 square mile state. It's quite large. It takes 9.5 hours to drive from the northeast to the southwest corner because there's no straight way to get there. And you'll be going through a lot of open prairie. Because of this, we can't necessarily use standard ways to engage all of the diverse stakeholders in our community. So over the last few years, we've been asking for guideposts from the community on how best to do that. We've been asking them what matters to them, and that's at local hospitals, small critical area hospitals, healthcare systems that are emerging in networks across the state, as well as communities. And they're pretty clear of what they want. And they know that this is, again, a picture of my state. There are parts of Colorado that look like this as well. They know what they want and they know what they need, and they know they can't physically always come to the table to participate in the important work that we're doing. They're very strong to tell us, and I used a technique I'm going to tell you about in a little bit called TRIZ, but they were quick to tell us that there are certain methods that shift their interactions as far as they're concerned, ways in which they can better become engaged. So for example, they can't stand talks by PowerPoint. And they said, tell us your story, which is why you won't see a lot of my logos and typical bullet points, because I use these backgrounds and these graphics when I'm talking to the community so that we can just have a conversation. They find PowerPoint very off-putting, and we're very clear to tell us. They also think it's really important we do more listening, and that as academic researchers, we're more comfortable with silence. Silence doesn't mean the community or the stakeholder isn't interested. It may mean that they're pondering a very tough question that affects them and their families and their communities. They're not scared of asking big questions, and they have a lot of patience for big questions. They want us to ask them and not be trivial. This is a long list. In addition to this last point, which I thought was really important, that they understand that there are social elements involved in all of the convening and work that we do, and mixing participants so that the banker is meeting the school district leader, who's meeting the teachers, who's meeting the families, who's meeting the family doc in the town, that all of those interactions are very meaningful there for them locally. Even after we leave, we help build those social bridges, and in a way, we empower that community to take what they're doing on their own from there. We don't need to be there at every step of the way. And they thought that just our convening locally is also very important. So how do you get a bunch of singers to sing as a choir when you have so many different stakeholders at the table? Well, choir and chorus directors know how to do this. Everyone has something to bring to the stone soup. Everyone has a role and an opportunity to play. And when that model is expressed to all stakeholders in our engagement, both small data and big data, there's an obvious respect for their uniqueness and a recognition that it takes the full choir to make the whole sound perfect. So we work through with communities looking at identifying problems, options, and tools. Fairly straightforward, and I'm going to talk about these liberating structures now in the context of this. Can't resist basketball right now, but the problem should be a slam dunk, right? We know how to do good engagement. When we are with people, we've got lots of strong techniques for facilitation and technologies to use in small and larger group facilitation. We tend to gravitate towards that one-on-one. But as I said, Kansas is 82,000 square miles. I can't get one-on-one voices to the table. So it's not such a slam dunk. Instead, we have to look for options, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, whether they're virtual platforms, real platforms, asynchronous platforms, ways for people to contribute and for us to extract and share local information into a larger process. We need feasible options. And the community basically asked me to find options and tools that would meet their needs. And that was coincident with me also learning about liberating structures. These 7 or 8 elements of liberating structures met every criteria the community shared with me. They wanted it to be expert-less. They said, we don't want an expert coming from the med center. Dr. Kimminau shows up with her colleagues who are, have lots of letters after their name as the only experts in the room. And in fact, they want to look at techniques and facilitation technologies that make everybody feel that they're expert. They want to be results focused. They consider a lot of what we do talking for the sake of talking and not focused on problems and result orientation. So they want to be purposeful whenever we do convene them, whether it's virtually or in person. They expect rapid cycle changes. This is a part of our sciences typically that we're not very good at. When we finish our work, we disseminate it to our colleagues, and 3 years later, we hope we have that article to show someone. But we don't necessarily find ways to communicate directly back with our stakeholders what the preliminary or final findings are. And they feel very strongly about these needing to be rapid cycle opportunities for engagement. They highlighted they want it to be fun. Like, it should be enjoyable and not a task to come to any of these engagement platforms. And that's not something we think about very much. We spend years doing some pretty unfun things sometimes, passing our exams and getting our degrees. But they really want some fun infused in this. And I was a bit of a skeptic that liberating structures could deliver that kind of fun, but I'll tell you, it surprised me because I actually enjoyed it too. Inclusiveness, multi-scale, being able to self-spread. What I'm doing today with you, I guarantee at least one of you is going to go out to liberatingstructures.com. You're going to take a look at what's out there. I'm not putting a plug in for them. I don't make a dime off of any of them. Wish I did. But go out and just take a look at some of these techniques because they'll be novel to you, but they may actually be exactly what you're looking for. And they're modular. You can combine them. So this is what you're going to find. This graphic is what you'll see is the little icons for each one of the liberating structures techniques. There's about 30 of them. I pulled these up because these were like the original 28. And I've used 7 of these in rural, remote, virtual settings. So not all of these will work, I don't think, well when you cannot convene everyone. But many of them do work quite well using Zoom like we're using today, using GoToMeeting, using Qualboard, using other techniques and platforms. And I'm going to talk to you about one in particular called Triz. Triz is a tool that asks participants to perfectly design failure. It asks for everything that could possibly contribute to failure. And it gets really, as the icebreaker, as the first step of Triz, it really can get funny. It can be like, well, we stay in the meeting all day and we never get around to actually making a plan. You know, ha ha. We keep doing what we've always done, so we're going to keep getting what we always get. So it can be very lighthearted, but it can also be quite revealing in terms of whatever the issue is in terms of systems-based barriers that exist that everybody knows about but don't really out themselves and talk about it very much. From identifying perfect failure, you then move to identifying what the core and underlying variables are contributing to failure. And in about a 3 or 4 step process, you get to actually figure out what you have to stop doing or start doing to be able to move your problem forward. That's a very high level sort of introduction to Triz, but I would just recommend that you go take a look. There are very easy step-by-steps. Anybody who's done facilitation or worked in groups of providers or patients or communities can use it. And it actually is a great way to, as I said, reveal some fundamental barriers that sometimes remain unhidden and you bump into later on. Have you ever had one of those where there's that elephant but you never saw it in the room, but the whole community or a group did, and you never really reveal that till you're well into your project planning or you're 3 milestones away and everybody finally admits, yeah, well, of course that was the problem. So Triz helps you reveal those early up. Overall, I guess here's my media platform if you want to talk more about this. I'm still a learner in using liberating structures. I am specifically looking at ways that we can engage our rural community using those structures because both logistics and in terms of representativeness, it's really important that we come up with as many items into that stone soup as possible. I think liberating structures holds great potential for both being used on virtual platforms and in person to flatten hierarchies and to allow for more genuine interaction among the folks you're trying to reach out to. So thanks, that's it for me today. And I think we're holding questions, right?
We're holding questions for one more speaker and then we'll do pairs.
Right, so I will leave that there for you.
Thank you.
Sure.
There she is. Thank you. Thanks, Kathleen.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay? Great. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you a little bit about the MyPaTH Story Booth project today. So actually, before I do that, let me just point out that this project is affiliated with the PaTH Clinical Data Research Network. This is one of the PCORnet networks, and one of our goals is to try to support the development and implementation of patient-centered research. So as part of meeting that goal, we developed the MyPaTH Story Booth project. It's really meant as a resource for researchers who want to develop patient-centered research projects. This is the premise of the project. Patient engagement is critical for patient-centered research, but it can, I think, as everybody here knows, be quite challenging. We believe that research topics should reflect areas that patients think are important, and that the patients should be research partners throughout the project, starting at the point of developing the research question. I think these are really important principles. However, there's also these, just a few of the challenges that arise. We know that patients have really rich embodied expertise from their lived experiences, but they, of course, typically lack technical skills in clinical research. It's really not fair to say to your patients, what are the right research questions for us to address? They don't know how to formulate a research question, often. The second, patients often don't have avenues for partnering with research teams. A lot of them don't know anything about patient-centered research or how to find a researcher. And at the time that research is planned, it can be difficult for researchers to engage with patients. Before they have that grant, they don't have any resources to reach out and engage people. And particularly for folks who work in non-clinical settings, it can be hard for them to figure out how to actually reach out and engage patients. So our response within our network was to develop the MyPaTH Story Booth project. So this is an archive of indexed, digital, patient and caregiver audio narratives. And these are narratives, these are just stories about their experience, people's experiences with health, illness, and accessing the healthcare system. Let me just pause for a minute and say, why did we do this? We did it because storytelling is something that every culture does, and that there's some good data out there that says stories are a fabulous way of bypassing all these differences in vocabularies and backgrounds, that people can communicate very highly technical information very effectively. And we did it as a way to form introductions between these different groups who are interested in getting to know each other, but don't always have the avenues in place to do so. So our overarching goal then was to create infrastructure to efficiently bring together researchers with patients or caregivers who have shared health interests with them. And more specifically, we wanted to make sure that the researchers, at the point that they're developing their thoughts on their next project, understood that the patients' and caregivers' perspectives. We wanted to be able to foster introductions between the two groups that can lead to true engaged research relationships. And we wanted to build links between patient-focused community organizations and academic researchers to help them form links with community groups. And finally, because it's a PCORnet project, we were hoping to create engagement opportunities that span different PCORnet affiliated institutions. Before I get too far into this talk, I wanted to point out that patient and caregiver input was very important contributor to the project, and that they contributed in a number of different ways. But one of the most important ones was we had a panel of patients that actually ran a planning session in one of our in-person stakeholder steering committee meetings, and it was really a kind of heartwarming, in particular, to see the data scientists in the room. These people who deal with nothing but numbers all day got so excited and said, wow, I've looked at EHR data for the last 20 years and I've never got to hear a patient tell me what these data reflect. So that was a neat thing. Some of the things that the patient told us that we needed to incorporate in the project was that the stories need to be posted online. They were fine with the idea of sharing their stories with researchers. They thought that sounded like a good idea. But they said, hey, you really need to share it between patients as well. We want people to realize that they're not alone out there. We want, if somebody can learn from my story, I want that to be able to happen. They appropriately pointed out that we needed to add phone-based interviews. At first, we were going to do just in-person stories in a audio booth. They said, well, with the phone-based interviews, the quality of the audio is definitely not as good, but it's so much more convenient for people, particularly for people who are sick. And so we've added phone-based interviews as well. They suggested we include caregiver stories, a really important addition to the archive. And more of a procedural piece, they suggested that after somebody tells a story, that we have a process in place where we say, you know, what do you think of that story? Do you want to share that particular story? Or do you feel like you want to redo it? You know, sometimes the story you tell wasn't exactly the story you meant to tell. So we have this check in there to make sure that the story that goes in the archive is really the one that they want to be sharing. So here's our overall logistics. How does the audio narrative collection work? I already pointed out they can tell their story in person or by phone. They can, over the phone, we always use appointments, but if you go to the physical booth, you could just drop in, and here's a picture of the booth here. For the picture, they're sitting outside the booth. If you actually were to tell a story, you go inside that little gray booth there with a window. It's basically a recorded conversation. It's sort of like the NPR StoryCorps model. You tell a story with an interlocutor who's usually it's usually a study staff member, but it could be that you could bring a friend or a family member, and we request that they keep their story to 20 minutes or less. There's a series of optional conversation prompts that people can take a look at before they tell their story, and they can show their conversation helper some questions that they would be interested in answering, or they can just ignore them and tell their story the way they want to tell it. If they want, they can have their photo taken, and then they complete a very brief survey. This is a little bit about the data we collect with the story. We collect the demographics that are shown there, person's perspective, whether they're a caregiver or a patient. We collect a little bit about the topics discussed. We basically ask them 3 questions. One is, what type of healthcare interaction or interactions does your story touch on? So that's like diagnosis or treatment, doctor-patient communication, those sorts of things. One is the anatomic location of any health problems they discuss. And one is some specific health problems that may not have a definite anatomic location. Those top 3 bullets on this page, these are then used, the answers to these questions are used to tag the story in order to make the archive searchable. We also have staff that answer the same questions, and we're validating the responses of the staff and the participants against a formal qualitative analysis of the true first 100 stories told. So that's the end of the data that get attached to the story. But the other questions that we ask the participants is whether they're interested in hearing about research engagement opportunities, because we want to do some matchmaking, and if they're interested in having their story posted to the web, because as I pointed out, that's what our patients said is really important to do. And if so, do they want to put their picture with it or not? So how will these narratives be used? Well, from a researcher perspective, I've outlined it here on this page. Researchers can use it in a couple of ways for research. First and foremost, we hope that they will listen to the stories and help develop research questions that are patient-centered, that really address topics that are important to patients and caregivers and lead to more patient-centered care ultimately. And then the archive is also available for formal qualitative analysis, studying patient and caregiver perspectives on health and illness. We also want researchers to be able to learn of patients who have an interest in their research topic who might want to get engaged as a stakeholder or a participant in their study. So we ask the researcher if they're looking for somebody to engage with. We've already asked the patient if they might want to get engaged, and if it appears that we have a match, we then reach out to the participants and say, hey, there's this opportunity that came up. What do you think? Do you want to hear more about it? And then the third way the stories are used is that a subset of the stories are being posted to our website now with the storyteller's permission. And that's the URL where these are linked now. Right now it's a pretty small subset, but that's something we're working on expanding. So I can tell you a little bit about the first 153 participants, because this is a relatively new project. 82% told their story from a patient perspective, and 18% from a caregiver perspective. Their average age is 51, but there's a pretty broad spread. You can see a standard deviation of about 19. 65% are female. About 14% have less than a high school education, although really quite a large proportion of this group have more than a college degree. And that's a challenge that we're trying to address, because storytelling is something that should be able to transcend educational backgrounds. And then the demographics, the racial ethnic distribution looks very much like Allegheny County, where the University of Pittsburgh is located, with 79% white, 13% African American, and about 5% Hispanic or Latino. We were really encouraged that data from our first 153 stories show high levels of satisfaction with the processes for the project, with 78% reporting that they were very satisfied and another 18% saying that they were satisfied with the processes. And the most common story topics addressed a very broad range of issues. So these different tags actually are not very good at differentiating stories, because almost every story puts in a large variety of these questions. So for instance, 82% of the stories address being treated, 81% doctor-patient communication, 64% finding out a diagnosis. We did also note that the stories are addressing health problems affecting many different parts of your body, as outlined here. So very broad distribution. And we are encouraged that the participating storytellers turn out to be interested not just in spending 20 minutes telling their story, that they're interested in getting more engaged. 85% of them actually provided permission to post their story on the internet. And 63%, more than half, are interested in learning about opportunities to participate as a stakeholder in research that's related to their story. Recently, we've been reaching out to community groups to try to partner with them, groups that have an interest in amplifying their members' voices. And the way that the processes that we worked out with them are here. You know, as we worked out these processes, we spoke with them and said, you know, what could make this of value to you? We would love it if your participants would share their stories. You know, we understand typically they feel that it would be great to have stories from among their constituents more visible in the world. But what they said would really help them about doing this is very often they are interested in actually having a copy of those stories from their own people that they could then use to also amplify on their website or for other purposes within their organization. So this is what we've worked out. If a group wants to, and they're working with us, we can tailor our recruitment materials for that organization. So, for instance, we worked with a childbirth center, and all of our posters there have pregnant women on them. We just ask that the community group shares information about the story booth with its constituents and invites them to tell stories if they would like. Every storyteller is then asked how they heard about the project, and in the multiple choice answer, we list all of our partnering organizations. And if a partnering organization is selected as the source of how the storyteller heard about us, we have a question up there that says, do you want to release a copy of your story to that group? And if they say yes, the organization actually has a back door to our portal and can go ahead and download a copy of the story and use it for their own purposes. In terms of next steps, you know, this project's pretty new. We've got right now between 230, 240 stories. And so we're basically branching out away from the just collecting stories to some new steps at this point. We're working on expanding the diversity of storytellers, particularly in terms of race, ethnicity, education, and geographic distribution. The story booth is leaving Pittsburgh and moving to Johns Hopkins this month, which should help in that effort. And we're working on engaging new community organizations. We're also now turning to engage researchers. Our researcher portal is going live this spring. The beta testing version is out so that researchers will be able to search the archive to hear the stories. And we've been working both with stakeholders and with our Office of Research to develop streamlined data sharing processes for doing research on the stories. And last, we're hoping that we can expand our public online story sharing capabilities, not just posting more stories to the web, but we're seeking funds to try to make a true sort of social media type experience for online story sharing between different patients and caregivers. And we hope to move our matchmaking to an automated online format that lets the patients, caregivers, and researchers have open public conversations. In terms of lessons learned, we've learned that many patients and caregivers are interested in sharing their personal stories and insights about health, illness, and navigating the healthcare system. Their stories focus on topics of importance to researchers. A digital story archive can record patient and caregiver perspectives in a manner that's satisfactory to the participants and accessible to researchers. We've learned that narrative collection can facilitate stakeholder engagement. We haven't actually done much facilitating yet, but over half of the participants are interested in learning about research opportunities, so we think there's a lot of promise there. And finally, a shared archive that supports many projects holds promise for efficient engagement practices. And this is because an archive story is not linked to just a single project and then sits on that researcher's server for the next 10 years. Multiple researchers can actually learn from that one story, and it could potentially lead to multiple engagement connections. Before I stop, I just wanted to acknowledge our partnering PCORnet, PPRNs, patient-powered research networks, and community organizations. And also give special thanks to the patient partners who helped us develop this project, especially Jim Ureg, who presented these data at, some of these data at Datapalooza earlier I guess last year at this point. And also to PCORI, our funder. And I think I'm not supposed to ask about questions. So let me stop there. Thank you.
So, yeah, if the two of you would mind coming up and having a seat while I introduce Dr. Erika Blacksher. Erika and I got together about a year ago to brainstorm some ideas about how to get this engagement core work started for our data science program. Erika is an associate professor at the University of Washington, and I knew her work because she's done a large number, I don't know the total number of engagement projects you've done, but it's got to be in the 30, 40 range around the country, using mainly deliberative methods for stakeholder engagement in health and health policy research. So she's really been integral in helping to bring this whole symposium together, and we asked Erika if she would be the moderator. So how we're going to do this is we will allow a couple of burning questions or clarifying questions if there are any right off the bat. And then we've asked Erika if she wouldn't mind giving a little bit of priority preference to people from the D2V program, because we have some products that we'd like to get out of this symposium. So we want to make sure that the people engaged in the D2V program get a chance to get their questions answered, and then we will open to the larger audience. And depending on how much time that takes, we're in great shape in terms of time. So we'll do another 15 minutes or so worth of Q&A.
Hi, everyone. Is this on yet? Can you guys hear me in the back? Yes, Matt asked if I would play Phil Donahue. I'm not anything like Phil Donahue, but I'll do my best. So burning questions, clarifying questions. Do we got any of those? Hands shooting up? Yes, Marilyn.
Dr. McTigue, it sounds like you are creating a database that's eminently useful. My question is,
Testing.
So a couple have started using it. They're typically researchers within PIT right now because most other people haven't heard about it, and because our researcher portal hasn't gone live yet. And that's because we did this in a tiered fashion. We felt like we had to actually have a bunch of stories before we went out and told the researchers, hey, come take a look at these stories. So we've got over 200 stories now. It's not a huge archive, but it's pretty big for qualitative data. And so we've got, there was an article published in the Society of General Internal Medicine Forum, which is the Gen Med organization's newsletter based on, which included story booth data recently. And there's a couple of graduate students who are using stories in their PhD work right now.
Yes. You want to?
Just a quick follow-up. You mentioned that you are thinking about a social media-based version of your project. Can you elaborate on that?
So it's not a social media-based version. We're hoping to improve the online story sharing. So we would like to make it more a place where people can have an easier time listening to each other's stories, commenting on each other's stories, and ideally what we would like is to have places where researchers can essentially advertise a study that they want to do, talk about who they're hoping to engage, and then that the people who might be interested in engaging with them can actually post questions and say, to explore that asynchronously. So a lot of people could actually have an opportunity to feed in it at the very early stages as to what this engagement experience should be like.
I have a question. Can I ask, how do you frame the process in terms of informed consent or the determination that the story will potentially end up as being part of a bigger research endeavor?
Yeah, that's laid right out in the first paragraph of the consent, that basically that we say we're asking you to share stories for researchers to be able to listen to use in health research. It's very broad. Yeah, or if they would like to get involved in engagement. That's actually a separate question, though. They can tell their story, but then they can say, don't contact me with engagement opportunities.
Okay, but they know that the story may be posted to, I'm still not sure I understand the pathway. So I can tell a story, I know it's for research, but your intent is that others might pick up that story to use for a community-based purpose, right?
So the only time a story gets picked up for community-based purpose is if a community group referred the person to us. So
the storyteller would come from that. I got you.
Right. So the storyteller working with the community group said, so say the Obesity Action Coalition says, hey, there's this cool story booth project. Think, if you want to do it, go check it out. And then if that happens, and we list Obesity Action Coalition as one of our partners, and then we say, would you like to release your story? If they say that they heard about us through that group, then we say, do you want to release a copy of your story to them to use for their own purposes?
Thanks.
But otherwise, it just stays in the archive.
Other questions, burning, clarifying, or otherwise?
Hi, this is for Dr. Kimminau. So you mentioned TRIZ a little bit, but could you give us any insights about why you would pick other types of liberating structures? You mentioned also there were 7 that you have used with some utility.
Right, I think, thanks for that question. I did just focus on TRIZ and kind of zip right through it. There are a number of these facilitating structures that I think work well, particularly for remote engagement. And that's really kind of what I was focused on today. But remote doesn't necessarily need to be 82,000 miles away. It could be remote in underserved and under-resourced communities that are much more local. One of the things that I think is really important is, we accumulate different strategies for engagement, but there are biases and issues with each one. People who come and participate are still a skewed potential sample of the folks who you might be intending, whether that's local or remote. What I like best and what I'm pitching for you to examine for your own use for engagement is that these liberating structures tend to take care of one of the most principal barriers I've faced in engagement, doing it for quite a while, and that is it's the differential power structure and position of participants that is often off-putting and just super scary. Folks with 3 and 5 degrees after their name are just scary people. Doesn't matter how much you smile and are pleasant and lovely, you're scary and you're smarter than me, and you use words that I don't understand, and I can't really say that I don't understand them because I'm smiling and I want to be polite. But even folks who come and feel like that are brave enough and find the fortitude to participate in something that doesn't really affect their day-to-day lives often. So all that as a background to say that the liberating structures are ways that most principally flatten hierarchy. There is no expert in the room. There is no Dr. Kimminau. There is no expert in obesity. It is a tool that allows for much more dynamic interpersonal relationships, conversations, and stories.
Yes, right here. I think we need to get a mic to you.
It sounds like you've created StoryCorps for researchers. And my question is, there's 2 actually. One is, why are you doing this? It gets to Matt's point of what is the point of all this? Are you trying to validate some underlying hypotheses? Are you testing usability? What exactly are you trying to do? And the second question is, when people tell you these stories, how do you differentiate opinion from evidence?
Can I tag a question on to that question, which is integral to his question, which is you started out asking, you created this story booth for researchers, and I'm wondering the extent to which you created the story booth for patients. In other words, storytelling is one way to make meaning of things, to make sense of your life, to make sense of your illness and disease, and it can be healing, it's been shown. And I wonder if you were doing anything in your evaluations to try to capture the role of storytelling in recovery and wellness.
So, right. So the why did we create it was because we're a PCORnet network, and one of the things we're supposed to be doing is to foster patient-centered research. And the sort of linking in your question is that I really came up with this in the perspective of saying, how am I going to help researchers do patient-centered research? And as we've worked with our stakeholders along the line, it's become, embarrassingly apparent that that we really should have been looking at much more, saying, what can this do for our patients from the beginning? So we're working on remedying that. But the truth is that it was created thinking about the researchers because I had a checkbox I had to address for PCORI. And as researchers came to us, we found that many of them were really interested, intrigued by the idea of stakeholder engaged research, but scared of it. So just as people are scared of the person with 3 letters behind their name, a lot of the researchers are really anxious about not knowing how to engage stakeholders, don't know how to find them, aren't sure about how to have a conversation. And so we really tried to create it as a tool to bring these 2 groups of people together. And it is. I mean, StoryCorps is a we clearly looked at their stuff as we created it, and we've spent a lot of time talking with StoryCorps and are hoping to collaborate with them in the future. So it's not an accident that it looks very much like StoryCorps. I'm trying to remember what the second question was. Opinion from evidence. We don't try to differentiate opinion from evidence. We let people tell the story the way that they want to tell the story, and I think that all of the literature on narrative says that you need to understand when people tell a story that the storyteller always picks facets of their experience that they tell. That a story is always framed with selected elements highlighted more than others. But that I think that it's not up to us to tell people what story to tell, that our goal is that informing research collaborations, that basically it's the start of a relationship. It's not the whole relationship, and they're going to build from there. And then in terms of analyzing what the stories say, that that could be a research question in itself. We do not say that these stories are 100% factual. They're stories. We ask people to tell their own story. So we expect that there are some facts in them.
And what about evaluation? Have you guys thought about trying to evaluate the role of storytelling itself in recovery and healing?
So that we haven't done that. I mean, there are other researchers out there who have shown that storytelling can be really powerful in that way. It's not something that we've built into our evaluation of the network. It would be a great thing to do, thinking about this website that we're trying to create.
Where did Suzanne go?
So I'm not part of the D2V program, just full confession. So does anyone else want to go first?
I think you're up.
Okay, thanks. Thank you both for your presentations. I really appreciated them. I am back on this story. So stories are really precious, and I'm wondering if there was discussion of incentivizing or somehow the researcher is getting paid. So if they're using the story to do their learning and then maybe create a design, and that goes on to become something really big, that then creates maybe more financial trade or whatever. What about the patient or the people that told the story? Mm-hmm. So, are they incentivized at all, or?
We don't pay storytellers, but we do view the stories as an introduction. That the primary goal of this is to create a story that researchers are going to hear, get inspired, partner with the storyteller, and bring the storyteller in as hopefully as a member of the research team. I mean that's really our goal in matchmaking, is that the patients will have a way to hook up with the researchers as part of the research team. And it's not a requirement in order to listen to the stories, but the whole purpose of the project is to foster patient-centered research. And so as we work with researchers, we basically strongly suggest to them that they consider having a actual collaborator on their research team who is a patient, or consider actually having a co-principal investigator who is a patient, and that person be reimbursed for their time appropriately.
Other questions, and I'm just going to emphasize the D2V core. Consuelo, did you also have your hand up?
I'm sorry if I missed this part in your presentation, but I was wondering how you envision to make the file searchable. So are you thinking about using an existing ontology like the ICD-9 for diseases, or how do you make sure that researchers can find files and search for files based on existing ontologies? Are you thinking about using anything?
I'm sorry, I missed a couple words there with the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Should I just repeat the question? Okay, so the question is simply, I'm interested in how you make this vast repertoire of files searchable, right? So if you're thinking about enabling research, are you thinking about using existing ontologies like the ICD-9 or other ontologies, or
No.
how do you envision that?
So what we used is we're using those we're not using ICD-9. We're asking people what their stories are about, and we're having staff code their answers, and we're having the storytellers code their answers. And we're using those answers to then code the stories. We're validating that against the first 100 stories we did a formal qualitative analysis on, and we're looking to see the positive and negative predictive value for the two different groups.
Thank you both for your presentations. They're very interesting, and I think nicely weave together the concept of stories and the importance of people's stories. And so of course it sounds like there's benefit to the people who are sharing their stories potentially, and to, as well as to researchers. I wonder what the benefit is to those who listen to the stories outside of the researchers. Do you have any sense of, of course, on Twitter, people are constantly, and on Facebook, constantly sharing their stories, and sharing them around the world, making them shareable. What do other people get out of this? And how can we learn about dissemination of findings, dissemination of innovations through this process?
I can at least speak to, with a story and a short example of the infectious nature of this kind of storytelling and its impact. Senior rare disease researcher had convened patients in a sort of a more traditional way, not really requesting stories or experience, but really used them as an advisory board. So they had built their proposal, had built their protocol, built their surveys, their patient-reported outcomes, and wanted a group to react to it. So they weren't part of the very beginning of the entire research project. But once things were kind of gelling together, then they did note that they were going after PCORnet research funding. They better put this in front of patients. So they did a very standard sort of react, here they sent out the surveys in advance, asked folks to read them, see what they thought about them, and come with their comments. Well, what do you think happened? Not a lot of commentary. It's great, thanks so much for studying our rare disease. This is great, what can we do to help? But there really wasn't very substantive interaction between the research team, a diverse research team, and the patients. That project went in and did not get funded. And PCORnet said, we're really kind of serious about engagement. This seemed way too superficial, which it was. And finally, the rare disease researcher who I had not worked with before waited to about 3 or 4 weeks before the resubmission was due and said, oh, maybe I should call Kim and see if he's got any ideas. So I was a last-ditch attempt. And so I brought one of the liberating structures model, and I said, okay, if you want me to help, I've got 3 weeks to do this, you're going to have to do the following things. You need to invite 15 to 20 of your patients. You need to get all of their fees covered. I want healthy foods and snacks. It's going to be at 5:30, so folks who work can come. You're going to offer 2 different times, and then you're going to get out of my way. And he didn't like any of that. But he did it anyway, because he really sort of felt a bit desperate, I think. And we used some liberating structures. They were in the room, but were not participating. So the research team was there. We started from the exact same place. But what I did was I started with what was missing, not what was present. And everybody came in on a first name calling basis. I didn't let any of the clinicians wear their white coats. In fact, I tried to keep them out of the room. And when we talked about patient-reported outcomes, something really important, when I asked what was missing, every one of their hands went up, to the shock of the entire research team. And they identified 2 key attributes of their condition that were not collected anywhere in the data that they saw. This is the same group who had just given the accolades and thanks to the researchers for the surveys and for the materials. And they missed 2 major, very important patient-reported outcomes. So the happy part of the story is those 2 patient-reported outcomes had validated measures that could be included. The project went in. I wrote up a full description of what happened. They got funded, and so $1.2 million later, we're now at the end of that study. And what were the 2 most predictive reasons for dropout from this drug trial? The 2 areas that patients identified. Okay, so that's the proofs in the pudding, right? Which is great. But what happened was there was an actual diffusion of innovation from that event that now had others starting to use techniques to bring in patient and other stakeholder voices into their research. And that rare disease researcher who thought they already had it all down and was ready to go is now the primary proponent of using engagement techniques and strategies like storytelling and liberating structures to collect information to enrich the research. So that's a long story to just tell you that there is this great rippling effect that when you hear a story, when you are engaged in a flattened, honest, authentic interaction, the impact it may have on others is really quite remarkable and dramatic. So it's just one story of it.
Other questions? All comers welcome.
Thank you. I wonder if either of you could comment on the disadvantages of storytelling, either in general or in a more specific case. And the general question I have is that in some of my work, when I talk to other patients whose stories maybe are not involved in making decisions about priorities, other patients can be skeptical of the use of stories because that's not my story. It's someone else's story sort of carrying the day. That's the general question. The more specific one, I think, is about the virtual setting. When I think about stories, I think of them as being lengthy, rich, and a lot of virtual communications are brief and maybe superficial. So do we know anything about how stories differ when they're in a virtual setting versus a lot of the settings we've discussed, which is in-person interviews and so on?
Sure. So I think there are clearly limitations to storytelling. A story is one person's story. It may not generalize very well to another person's experiences at all. And to some extent, there's a possibility that people might tend to overgeneralize from a single story. I think that's probably the biggest risk. However, and then I guess the other thing is the point that was brought up over here is that it's a perspective. Stories are not always entirely factual. Memory is not entirely accurate. That different people are going to care about different things and are going to emphasize different things in their projects. So if you really want a totally factual recollection of events, that it may not be the best way to do it. However, I think that is more than offset by the incredible rich information that is conveyed, which we don't have another good way of capturing. Did that get at everything you're asking about?
And then the comment about virtual storytelling. Are virtual stories the same as real stories? And they're brief, they look different. It's not like sitting in an interview setting listening to someone's story on StoryCorps.
Right. Well, so I would say that 20 minutes is not so brief to be able to tell a story, right? It's not the same thing as having an hour long qualitative interview, but to me, the stories you run into sitting next to somebody on the bus is much more like the 20-minute story that you hear in our virtual stories than a story that you might tell in an artificial research situation like that. I think that saying digital stories seems to me like a very broad term, and it would make me a little bit uncomfortable. It's different from a tweet. So you could tell a story in a tweet, you could tell a story in a 20-minute conversation. So I think that anytime you move to the digital setting, you lose intonation, and you are losing a lot of the visual cues, and that certainly takes something away from the story. I think that that's what I would worry about the most.
One thing about stories, we tend to, I think that stories are best designed for communities and patients, but I've used storytelling with clinicians, with family physicians. It's very difficult for me to stop them short of a 20-minute story. So don't think that these stories are the sole domain of patients and caregivers. Using Qualboard, anybody use Qualboard for data collection? Again, a new tool I've discovered. Qualboard is a way to be able to collect asynchronous information around a topic or a question. And it was really perfectly suited. I was sharing it with Kathleen earlier. It's really well suited for clinicians' busy schedules. They can asynchronously jump into the conversation whenever they have a break. And their stories are quite intense and long when they feel like sharing them. So I think technologies that are virtual give a variety of ways to tell stories, not always certainly from first person, but not necessarily verbal. They actually would type up very long stories of challenges around, we were asking about caring for patients with chronic pain, and they would go on and on with a very long story. Again, to try to distill then key factors was quite challenging, but whether they're written or whether they're verbal, I think virtual platforms can permit and encourage storytelling.
I think we have a question here. Both a question and a comment. So the comment is to the question about downsides of storytelling. From my experience, our team's experience, one of the downsides is that researchers often don't understand the stories. So when we are eliciting input from stakeholders, especially patients and community members, researchers are often looking for some explicit, specific advice and guidance. And when they get a story, they're sort of like, oh, well, huh. And so one of the things that we found is that we actually have to interpret the stories for the researchers. And I think that's also part of the push for things that are not words, but numbers. And I think when we're pushing people to express themselves in multiple choice or in things that can be counted, then we're really missing, much of what you're saying about the key aspects there. So, so I wonder if you have any advice or suggestions on how, if stories are going to be captured virtually, what the platform might think about or the builders might think about in helping people to use them, and that might be thinking too about how we incorporate some of the digital things like emoticons and capturing conversations and thinking about that as part of a story.
So let me just take up the piece that you brought up in the beginning about researchers not understanding stories. My impression is that researchers sometimes have difficulty understanding how a story answers their question. And so what we tried to do was to flip the perspective, and instead of waiting until the researcher asks their technical question and then says, well, they didn't really answer it, actually say to the patient first, can you please tell that researcher what it's like to live with diabetes, what it's like to live with whatever it is that you're experiencing, so that with the goal that that they would then be able to share their own perspective rather than trying to be pigeonholed into responding to whatever little question that the researcher raised. It does raise a challenge to the researcher, but my hope is that since they didn't already pose a specific question, if they may come in with more of an open mind to hear what the person is telling them, as opposed to just focusing on, well, they didn't answer exactly what I asked.
I think that is our last question because we're at time, so we're going to pivot to our next panel. We need to welcome Doctors Reuter and Balmer, and they're going to focus on the strengths and weaknesses in the use of virtual platforms. So we need to pivot. Thank you very much.
I can wave it to you when you're finished after this.
Okay. Okay. And then just staying close to the mic, right?
Yeah, and if you go on the ground, just grab that mic and you can.
And then this is just going back and forward and the point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to use my 15 minutes to tell you a little bit more about a tool that our group has been developing. It's called Trial Promoter. And so we're coming from a very different angle. We're trying to enable more rigorous evaluative research when it comes to communication and dissemination of science. And so our group is interested in two different aspects. I'm actually part of the CTSA, the Clinical and Translational Science Awards at the University of Southern California. And so I have been part of the CTSA for a couple of years. And so lately, they have been very much focused on clinical trials and turning the CTSA consortium into a clinical trial engine, and not all of us are very happy with it. But one challenge that I found very intriguing is they're very interested in developing evidence-based clinical trial recruitment strategies and methods. And so this is part one that you see here. So when it comes to using Trial Promoter, the tool that I want to tell you a little bit more about, we are very interested in actually developing evidence-based clinical trial recruitment methods, and we focus on digital methods and social media. And the other element that you see here is focused on health promotion and interventions. So similar approach, but we're really interested in developing evidence-based digital health promotion interventions. So this is the tool. It has actually its own website if you're interested. It's an evolving code, I should say, that we make available for public view. And if you want to play with it, just let us know. And this is actually a publication if you're interested. You can check it out. But the tool itself, what it does is it allows us to run different types of experiments at the same time. So imagine you have a couple of different types of messages that you want to test, and you want to see how effective are these messages in terms of engaging people online, getting their attention, and making them do what you want them to do. So for example, in the context of developing evidence-based clinical trial recruitment methods, we really want to see whether these messages make people click on a link, go to a study web page, check out the content about a study, contact the study team, and then actually enroll in the study. And so the beauty of it is that we can look at language patterns, we can look at psycholinguistics. And here, this is just a little note that in one of our latest experiments, this was a study for the FDA. We ran this experiment. Imagine we have a couple of different psycholinguistic message variants, and we send these out across different platforms, and Trial Promoter does all of that automatically. So just as a quick overview here, this is not something I want to go in detail in, but here you see that for this FDA-related experiment, we actually looked at a couple of different message types. We looked at perspective taking, information packaging, numeracy, and we ran these experiments at the same time. So imagine these messages go out, scheduled times across different platforms with minimal human intervention. We don't have to do much. We just collect the data on the messages. And here you see some examples of, this was actually one of our earlier experiments focused on clinical trial recruitment, and you see these are experiments, these are messages that are automatically packaged by Trial Promoter. Here you can see, for example, Here you can see a message that, for example, does not include a photo. Here you have a photo, so we tested different kind of variants, messages with and without photos, different types of psycholinguistics approaches. So you can do a lot of things to kind of get a better sense what really resonates with our audience, what engages them, what gets their attention, and what makes them click on a message. And then here, just for those of you who are more interested in the flow, so TrialPromoter has different components. It has a gigantic database. This is where we put in, if you imagine, we have pre-approved IRB, pre-approved message templates, which are very essential to what we're trying to do. And then these are parameterized. So TrialPromoter, for example, substitutes elements such as disease hashtags, which are very important when you're thinking about engaging disease communities on Twitter. It also replaces different types of URLs. Let's say, for example, for one experiment, we wanted to randomize different kind of clinical trials. So the tool randomizes the trial. It knows what the trial is about. It randomizes and it puts in the right disease hashtag. It puts in the right URL. So it kind of looks at these aspects and packages these messages automatically. I'm out of breath. It's the baby. It's not me. It's the baby. And then we have this messenger component that I just described, which I love because we don't need a human. The tool is smart enough to know this trial or this message is about a certain topic, and it packages these messages. So the randomization effect is really important to us because we want to avoid bias in our experiment. Then we have the scheduling. Here we use a third-party application buffer. This is the tool that we're using currently. And then we have a collector. So this is something that I'm going to talk more about. It's how do we get the data on these messages, which is really important. And then I already described the funnel. So we don't only want to know about the messages, we want to know what do these people do in the end, right? So for clinical trials, for example, how much time do they spend on these clinical trial web pages? Do they contact the study team? Do they enroll? And that's a real challenge for us. So here is what I just talked about. It's an example of what we're trying to look at. So one aspect is, like I said, oh, I'm sorry. Here, this is the social media component. So I already mentioned that we send out these messages across different types of platforms. And so we are really interested in different things. But the primary outcome variable here is really the click rate. So we're looking at impressions and clicks. And then we want to know when they come to the web page, what are they doing here? So here, for example, we focus on the number of pages viewed, if it's applicable, and also the time spent on the web page. And the reason why I wanted to share some of our outcome measures and metrics with you is because I'm supposed to talk a little bit more about the challenges that come with virtual platforms when you want to collect the data, analyze the data, validate the data. And then here, as I said, when it comes to conversion for the clinical trial component of our research, we look a lot at what do they do on the website, do they contact the study team, and then do they enroll? And for the FDA-related project that I briefly mentioned, that was a particular project where we just wanted to get a better sense. Do people even pay attention to these types of messages and different types of messages? And then do they check out a more educational website that provides more content about the topic? This was an anti-smoking campaign. And so it shows you already that we're looking at a couple of different types of metrics. Here I also listed secondary metrics. So especially for the engagement with the message itself, we're also looking at the sharing rate. So I think it's not only important to see whether people click on a message, but sharing is important because it amplifies your message. So that's another very important key variable. But you can already see we de-emphasize likes, for example. So I think when it comes to developing reporting standards that we really don't have for social media related research, it's something that we don't care about really, whether people like it or not. There might be something that I miss right now, but at this point we don't really focus on it. And here, just to give you a sense, this is a screenshot of TrialPromoter. It's the dashboard. So here you can see how it nicely pulls in data that we are interested in on a message basis. So here's a particular message. It tells me how many clicks, impressions. The primary outcome I already mentioned is click rate for us. And then it looks at other types of metrics. And I can also search by different platforms. So I mentioned we looked at this experiment. We looked at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So it does that for different platforms for us. And here it also surfaces the most the messages that show the most engagement. This is just for the impatient people, and I'm counting myself among them. So I just want to see on a daily basis what's going on, what's surfacing, so it does that too. So you can imagine you can apply this kind of concept, this technical concept, to other measures that you're interested in. Okay, so now I'm diving into the piece that I'm supposed to talk about. 5 minutes, okay. So there are a lot of challenges, I should say, and I'm sure the second speaker on this topic will dive into some of these issues as well. A couple of things to highlight. I already mentioned the lack of reporting standards, and I personally, I have been thinking about writing a paper about this when the time is right. But I think we really need to think about how we report social media related research studies. How do we collect the data? How do we even define certain metrics? And one of the first things that I wanted to highlight is that the metrics are even across platforms. They use different definitions. So it's really important to think about that. One example here that I'm listing here is Twitter has likes. Facebook recently introduced reactions. So then how do you compare these kinds of things if you're interested in measuring it? Another thing that is a little bit challenging is we found a solution around this, but I already explained, for us it's really important to send out a specific message, to know who, for certain experiments at least, who is engaging with this. And so we're using very customized URLs. And here, for those of you who are interested in the technical details, we're using UTM parameters just as a quick solution if you're interested in that part. Another thing to think about is the platform policies, which also make this type of research very challenging. So as I already mentioned, we are very interested in seeing how effective messages are. And if you want to do that, you have to create a kind of artificial environment, right? So you have to make sure the message is out there, and we're looking at organic and advertisements. So you have to make sure the message is exposed to people for the same time. You have to make sure it's powered for the same amount. So let's say on different platforms, you have to pay different amounts of dollars to power for 10,000 hits or 1,000, impressions, I should say. And so that's a challenge. You have to kind of make sure you have a balanced design here. And then ads can also be delayed. So yeah, just for the second point, I just wanted to highlight for clinical trials, I don't know whether everyone is aware, but clinical trials cannot be advertised on Twitter. So it's not possible for us to do this type of research where we, for example, compare organic versus advertised messages on Twitter. But for the FDA project, which was actually an anti-tobacco campaign, we were really surprised to get we faced a lot of barriers. So Twitter made us kind of provide descriptions and information about the project. And even though it was anti-tobacco related, FDA approved, we still got a lot of messages, and the account, for example, the project account was suspended. So it was tricky. And that's really tricky when you're trying to collect data in a kind of controlled environment and they suspend the account, and it was a nightmare a little bit, but we learned a lot. So that's just something to keep in mind. Data. For the data itself, I just wanted to share 2 examples. So organic data, for example, if you decide to collect these, they are cumulative versus when it comes to ad data, you can download reports on a daily basis, but it's very difficult to automate these kind of steps. And we are all about automation. And then I already mentioned the start and end time for ads. Just a little bit more about that. So like I said, even if we have a message out there, we want to make sure that, let's say, an ad runs for 3 days. And that's very tricky, again, to have a consistent study design across different platforms, because Twitter even measures time different than Facebook. On Facebook, you can clearly set an ad for 3 days. On Facebook, they counted 1.5 days. So it's really getting into mathematics. It's challenging for us to make sure we have a consistent design across platforms. 2 minutes, okay. Let me highlight here a few things. Let me highlight one last thing because I only have 2 minutes left, but I think another challenge is to find the right third-party application to help you get the data. I think because there's a little advice that was already mentioned in the morning, not only guidelines, but advice in terms of what platforms are good to work with, what platforms use the right definitions. Even platforms and third-party providers, they have their own definitions of impressions, for example. So it makes it very difficult to kind of come up with a consistent study design and make sure we collect the data that we need to collect. So I think that's the bottom line of this slide that you see here. We use ClickMeter a lot, but there are certainly other platforms out there. And then let me close with one piece that we learned in terms of analysis. So after these experiments, so for example, the FDA experiment itself, we sent out more than 1,000 messages. So then we had a lot of data to work with. And I think our biostatistician that we involved, she's fantastic, but it was a challenge for her because the main thing is that we have a lot of zeros, and these guys that we work with, they use the clinical trial data, and they have a lot of values. And so I think let me just read this to you because it summarizes perfectly what she's trying to convey here. So a main challenge is the large number of zeros that result from this kind of data we generate with digital platforms. Because the data is count data and distribution is heavily skewed towards zero. So we use a negative binomial distribution to model it. From this model, we can estimate marginal effects to obtain the click rate, for example, for messages or website use. However, these models don't fit perfectly, so we are considering using Bayesian methods. And I have to say I'm not a Bayesian expert. We had to get another expert on board that knows a lot about the Bayesian method. But it is challenging to kind of interpret this type of data when you're trying to look for patterns. So that's certainly work in progress, and the FDA study is just being prepared for publication, so we're working on that part. Okay, looking ahead, I just wanted to close with a general statement. If you're interested in using Trial Promoter for your type of research, we are looking for collaborators. If you're interested in building out new features, we are very much interested in partnering. I already said I think there's a great need for standardized reporting guidelines for social media related research. It's something that is very important. And then I don't think I will involve the last two. So if you have more questions, just feel free to contact me. Here's my contact information. I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop right here. Thank you.
Oh, aha. So not to be a killjoy, but it is 3:16 and I've been tasked with keeping us on schedule. So next up, you're there. Great.
I'm here.
You're there. And everything's up and working. Okay, good.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, first of all, for having me here. It's great. I've learned a lot even from the presentations already, and I hope to talk a little bit, as much as I can in 15 minutes, about the ethics of virtual engagement. Now, there are a lot of different ways of looking at engagement. We've talked some about research ethics. We could talk about research ethics related to virtual engagement, but what I'm really going to focus on for the next 15 minutes or so is the ethics of virtual engagement itself. And I have a rather simplistic way of looking at virtual engagement or engagement of patients generally, and that's here. And it's the connection between the why, the how, and the how well. And what I hope to suggest briefly over the next 15 minutes is simply that the language and concepts of ethics, of bioethics, of medical ethics, can really help inform each of these steps in engagement. The why we engage, the how we engage, and the how well we do it. So the why of engagement generally, outside virtual engagement, has actually been written about and thought about quite a bit. And so on this slide, I just want to show in outline schematic form how we can connect some of the basic ethical principles we may be familiar with, such as beneficence, non-maleficence, do no harm, respect, and justice can be translated into ethical goals, the whys of engagement. So as you can see, there are quite a few. This is a pretty busy slide of the different types of ethical goals that could be served by different engagement methods. So things like ensuring scientific quality, protecting individuals from harm, enhancing benefits for individuals or communities through the use of engagement methods, involving vulnerable or marginalized groups, however those might be defined in the engagement process and in the research itself, something we've heard about already. And one in particular that I'm interested in, which is the idea of improving trust for the research project itself, for an individual discrete research project, or in the research enterprise in general. So these are just a number of the ethical values that could serve as a foundation for why we engage communities, participants, individuals in research. So those are the whys. Now I want to turn to the hows. Now there are a lot of ways of thinking about the hows of engagement. This is just one simple way of divvying up methods of engagement between roughly the number of people that are involved in the engagement exercise. So you can see at the top, there's the engagement of individual patient advocates or representatives, perhaps as part of committees. This is something I'm familiar with my work at the health system level, the idea of patient representatives serving as advocates in particular committee work. Add a few more people into the bunch, and what do you get? You get a patient or a community group, sometimes known as a patient and family advisory council. So now you have a group of people hoping to engage with the research in some way. And then most broadly, I think about add a lot more people in, and you've got the public. You've got a broader event, town halls, deliberative events, and so on, where you're really trying to engage the public more generally. And what I want to point out already is the connection between the how and the why. So when you think about engaging individual patient advocates or representatives, you might think this has a rather modest ethical goal to offer sort of lay insights or individual insights into a particular question. Community groups, particularly when focused around particular diseases, may have a slightly different goal, which would be to inform specific questions. It could be around choice or use of patient-reported outcomes. And then public events, these town halls, these deliberative type exercises, may have a different ethical goal yet. And that could be to improve public trust in research generally. And we've heard, I think, hints of this throughout a lot of the presentations today. So those are a little bit about the hows of engagement. And I think it's really important to point out that there's no one method, I think, that's likely to achieve all of the ethical goals that you saw in that prior slide. There's probably no one perfect method that's going to be able to achieve those different ethical goals. Now, when I talk about the how of engagement, here I think it's important to point out that this concept of community engagement and the challenges is not at all new. This is an article from 1969. It's Arnstein's Ladder of Participation, which was a study of community involvement in urban planning in the late 1960s. And to point out a few parts of this ladder, you can see that the top of the ladder, if you think of this teleologically as where we should be going, is actually citizen control. It may be hard to read, but the top of that ladder is citizen control. Now, what would it be like to have citizen control of the research enterprise? To really cede power and control to participants? That may or may not be where we're heading, and I'll point out two different rungs as well. At the bottom rung of this ladder is manipulation. The idea that by engaging or involving individuals in these sorts of exercises, you could actually be manipulating them. And what's the line between a manipulation and informing? And then lastly, I want to point out that in the middle of the rung is something we've heard about a lot in the research setting, which is the idea of community consultation. And I point it out because according to Arnstein's ladder, consultation is actually linked up with a degree of tokenism. Sort of a pejorative term that most of us would think we're actually trying to avoid tokenism, but Arnstein in this ladder considers consultation as a part of tokenism. So really interesting elements of power that I think are traditional bioethics concepts, the ones I just showed you, beneficence, respect, and justice. I think those concepts need to be supplemented with more sociological or political theory concepts, because it's there where we find greater attention to the power dynamics that we also heard about in an earlier presentation.
And at the same time, we have to keep in mind that some believe, and this is maybe a question, some believe that the virtual methods, the nature of social media and social networking is really uniquely positioned. These methods are uniquely positioned to equalize power. So if you see this diagram on the bottom, it's the idea of changing from a one-to-many unidirectional communication to a many-to-many style of communication. And is it the case that virtual methods, by being many-to-many, truly level the playing field in a way that mitigates power imbalances? Again, an open question. Why? How? Now we're on how well. You may not have recognized it, but I purposely put how well in a black box because I think this is the area where we need the most work in thinking about what it means to do engagement well. Now, there are examples out there. We've talked about PCORI today. PCORI does have a toolkit known as We Enact that includes what we would think of as being ways to evaluate engagement. Here you see just a couple questions from this toolkit. The first question says, how much influence did you have? So this is a question that, in other words, evaluates an engagement participant's perceived influence on the process of the research itself. The question below, which is interesting to me in some respects because I hinted about the concept of trust, it says, how much did you feel trust, honesty, transparency, shared learning, and give and take relationships while working on this project? Interesting question, packs a lot into one single stem. But this is an example of the types of how well, that is how we evaluate the engagement exercise itself. Now, it's not the only way. Just to quickly show you CBPR, community-based participatory research. This is a model from the University of New Mexico, which is a conceptual model of CBPR. What you can't see here is that if you go to this site and look at this model, you can click on any of these particular domains and find outcome measures for all of them. Now, before you do that and jump into it, it's another question we have to ask, which is virtual engagement or is engagement really the same as community-based participatory research? It's not clear to me that all projects are CBPR, nor should they be, but it's just an example of the types of resources we might have if we wanted to evaluate engagement. And I happen to think that evaluation is itself an ethical obligation that is linked to these concepts of why and how. So the why, the how, and the how well. So I've talked a lot about engagement in general because there's a lot of work that's been done with research engagement in general. And now I want to ask more of a framing question related to virtual engagement. And that is, which, if any, of these ethical goals could be met by virtual engagement methods? This is actually two questions, at least two questions. Are there goals that virtual engagement could better meet? In other words, if we went back to that list of the whys, are there certain goals that virtual methods actually are better than traditional in-person methods? Or related, I may have messed that up, sorry, step back. Are there goals that virtual engagement could better meet? I mean, they're the same goals and we can meet them. Or are there goals that are uniquely met by virtual engagement methods? So two separate questions when we think about the transition from engagement in general to virtual engagement. Are they unique or could we do it better? Again, I think this is an open question. There are some historical lessons that I think cast a shadow on the way we think about this today. In 2014, PCORI did have a matchmaking app challenge, a contest where they solicited ideas for ways to virtually engage stakeholders in research. These were the three winners: PatientPowered.us, Well Springboard from the University of Michigan, and Partners in Research. And unfortunately, to be honest, not many of these lasted. So if you go to PatientPowered.us, you can see who they are now. This is from earlier this week. And as of now, a few years later, there are 44 patients involved. Well Springboard, if you go to their site, says this: we've decided to conclude the Well Springboard experiment and build what we have learned from it into improving our community engaged research efforts across the spectrum. So Well Springboard, again, is also not sustained. And if you go to Partners in Research, it too seems like it really hasn't sustained the momentum that started about 3 or 4 years ago when these apps were funded. So what do I think would be the key components of ethically informed engagement? Well, not surprisingly, I think number one is to define the goals of the engagement. Number two is to choose a method that will achieve that goal, whether it's virtual or traditional. Number three is to ensure diversity. I think the diversity and engagement process likely improves the outcomes of the decision making. And I think it may, depending on the engagement method, instill fairness in the process itself. So the process of engagement would be improved as well. I think you have to maximize the benefits for individual participants and the community. Earlier was mentioned that storytelling can actually be a benefit for the individuals who are involved in telling the story. And I think that's really important, that those sorts of benefits count in our ethical calculus of how we do engagement, but also to the community. I think we have to minimize the harms, intentional, unintentional, or otherwise. We have to protect individual informed choice to engage. That can be complicated in a social network setting where there's trust among members of a social network, and individuals within a social network that's engaged for this purpose could feel pressure to participate in the engagement because of that social network. We have to protect privacy and confidentiality. We have to avoid unnecessary disruption of the community or the social network by virtue of our presence within it. I think we've hinted a little bit at this today, the idea that you can, by being a researcher entering a particular network, end up disrupting it. And then, as I mentioned, 6, this ethical obligation to evaluate both the intended and unintended consequences, both processes and outcomes, and including the network effects if social networks are involved. The idea that these effects can spread throughout the social network. Now, you won't be surprised that all of this relates to the original why, the how, and the how well. So that original framework comes back when we look at these 6 key components. So what are some questions ethics would ask of particular engagement endeavors? Well, key questions like who should be included or maybe excluded? Are there people we don't want involved in the engagement exercise? A question that's just as appropriate to ask from the standpoint of ethics as who should be included. What should the goal be? When should different stakeholders be engaged? In other words, was the process open and fair? That is, there wasn't a constrained agenda from the outset. This relates to the idea of ceding a little bit of control or power to participants. How will power imbalances be mitigated? How can stakeholder participants be empowered to foster a process with true dialogue? There are techniques for this. And how do we know we're achieving our goals? Now, just to spend a little bit of time before I finish up in my 15 minutes, I want to show you 2 cases where I think ethics can inform parts of a process of stakeholder, especially patient or community engagement in research. So if you imagine a research team wants to engage virtually with patients to understand what they value, such as through patient-reported outcomes, in heart failure treatment to inform health system decision-making, you might imagine a process like this, where you partner, you engage, you evaluate, and then you disseminate. And again, ethics is going to ask questions at each of these steps. Should we use an existing, oh, sorry, it says should be us. This is the hazard of changing your slides in the morning of your presentation. Should we use an existing virtual patient network or a new one? And are there different obligations, different ethical obligations when we create a network for the purposes of engagement versus using one that already exists? And most importantly, or probably more importantly at least, who is in or who's out of this social network? So we can use social network analysis research techniques to really understand who is in the social network that we may be engaging with. When you start to engage with participants, again, how can power imbalances be equalized? Can the privacy of participants be respected, or should it? There are techniques that focus on partial anonymity and allowing participants in the process to be anonymous. Should they be? And can disruption of that network be minimized? When it comes to evaluation, I'm most interested in this concept of 360-degree evaluation of both the process and outcome measures, including both process and outcome measures that could be suited to the why and the how of this engagement. In my world, with health system engagement of patients through PFACs and otherwise, one of the major issues we've seen is that all too often only one party of the engagement completes the evaluation. We want all parties to complete the evaluation. And then lastly, how can we truthfully report and transparently disseminate the findings of the engagement, via the MAP social network that we did in that first step of partnering? So you can see how ethics asks questions that I think inform cases like this one. I have a second case here. It relates to big data. And I'll just quickly say that here, when you're engaging about big data questions, and an example like this one, where it's integrating EMRs, social service data, other kinds of data to try to promote population health, this is a really different engagement activity than a disease-specific focus looking at PROs in a particular disease condition. And so the salient ethical questions become different. Who's excluded? How can their voice be heard? How can information be presented to ensure a valid response? How do you take care of framing effects and avoid manipulation? In this setting, this big data, population health, more of the public setting, what role should the outcome play in the policy level decision making? What role should the outcome of engagement play when policymakers make the hard decisions about integration and how data would be used? So just to give you a flavor that when the activity is different, the ethics are different, and the outcomes and what we care about are going to be different as well. No matter what we do, there are going to be residual ethical tensions. I've mentioned this concept of participant anonymity, protecting privacy through anonymity in the process, but this can be in tension with ensuring a group that's representative, right? The less you know about the participants, the harder it is to have a group that's representative if you think a representative group is what you need to answer the question that you have. It may not be, and so on. There are other ethical tensions that will be left over. So what are the future directions? Well, I think we need a better understanding still of the fundamentally ethical why, or whys, as I suggested on that first slide, of engagement. I think we need more rigorous, validated process and outcome measures to evaluate engagement. And what I'm most interested in the future is the idea of comparative effectiveness research on different engagement methods. So if you have the goals, you have the why, you have the how, can you compare different methods and see which one is better to achieve the goals that you set out for an engagement? So I'll stop there. And we have a special
Okay, so the special this time is rather than you asking Matt questions, we're gonna, the two Matts. Would you like to join us? Then we'd have three Matts.
Then we have a beginning of a joke.
I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere. So we're going to ask you guys some questions. So could you all pull out your phones? And I don't know the name of the person in the booth, but can you hear me in the booth? And if so, can you swap over? Thank you. So while we're swapping over, are there any clarifying questions for Matt DeCamp?
Hi, that was really great. I don't know if this is a question or I'm just would love your thoughts on thinking about how during a focus group, as an example, the moderator is trained to deal with some of the power dynamics potentially within the group that some people may dominate or may be rude or, you know, what have you. And so that's part of the moderation, the live human contact moderation. So I've just been toying with this idea of using these virtual platforms, and this point that you made about, it's an open question about equalizing power. But thinking of it as that comparison with in-person engagement, and that there's someone who can help moderate versus virtually where that isn't a factor.
Or may or may not be a factor. It would all depend on the actual method of the virtual engagement, because you could imagine that technology could make it possible to have a virtual moderator there for exactly that reason. But of course, then it becomes, once you have an observer moderating, then it becomes a different type of activity compared to one where you're just observing what participants themselves might be doing within a particular social network. So I think it's possible, and I think there are reasons, good reasons, just like in the in-person setting, why you would want a moderator for some cases in a virtual environment.
You know, we had a conversation about an analogous thing the other day. It turns out in psychiatry, there's some evidence that if you interlocute, if you talk with someone using virtual reality goggles, who's not really there, who's just, you know, a fake psychiatrist, people are more honest and enjoy the relationship better than with a real person. So I'm picturing the possibility of literally a virtual moderator. So not a real person who's moderating, but an algorithm that is watching the conversation and making sure that people are being respectful, that everyone gets a chance, that if someone hasn't spoken up for the last 79 minutes, that they get a prompt that says, did you have anything you wanted to add, right? You could imagine, and I don't know if this is where Facebook is going with meaningful engagement, but you could imagine a set of criteria for what a meaningful conversation looks like and creating an electronic moderator that manages to generate that kind of a conversation. So I'm gonna ask you all to do something really simple, just as a get started question here. This is also a test because the younger people will get this first, I'm sure. So what you're gonna do is text AMCSOM, Anschutz Medical Campus School of Medicine. I would have picked a better one, but AMCSOM, you're gonna text that word to the number 37607. When you do that, you'll get a text message back. And then you're going to reply to that text message your answer to this question. So A, B, C, or D. We'll see. Oh, look at that. 100% are, oh, okay, we got it.
I didn't get to join. Oh, there, I got it. This is fun.
There has to be at least one person in this room older than 50 years old. It could take them a while, but that's I'm sure they'll be on soon.
That's the digital divide that's still
there. Okay, so I hope everyone is more or less on. The instructions will stay at the top, so if you didn't get on yet, keep trying. It will work. So, whoa, oh, those must be people who are still answering the last question. So I've switched to a new question now. This is a question that I just generally use because it frames so much of the conversation these days in terms of the types of discussions that are of interest to people in bioethics. So, so we'll see where people stand in this room. When they stop moving for a second, we'll move on to the next one. This is no comment necessary, I think. It's just to sort of see who we are with regard to political affiliations. Okay, so what is the most important ethical issue to address in using virtual platforms for engagement in health research? So you've just heard 15 minutes of conversation. Type in a word, and this is going to create a word cloud of the words that you put in. Oh, sorry, I have to unblind it. And while this is popping up, I'm going to just ask Matt, because this is what we wanted to do here, now that we're done with the basic questions, is to just have you reflect on what you're seeing here in terms of the most important ethical issues to address.
Well, it's interesting to me that privacy is the largest, but I also would note that if you took a lot of the concepts that are showing up there about, and they're moving quickly, they keep reassorting, which is, but inclusion, representation, a lot of justice-based issues about inclusiveness, or what some have called in the literature, probably people think about deep inclusion as being a key part. You know, one of the issues I think about with representativeness, I hinted at in the presentation, is this concept that we tend to gravitate, perhaps because of democratic notions, toward representativeness as being so important in a demographic sense. Just to push on that a little bit, it's not clear to me that for all the questions researchers want to ask or want to engage people with, that representativeness demographically is really the key determinant of the ethics or not of a particular engagement. You know, that's really important, I think, for policy level, public type decisions. and probably less important for some of the more discrete ethics projects that are out there, or research projects that are there.
The question is, why do you say that?
Why? You know, it's a great, no, thanks. And I have different views about inclusiveness too that will probably cause people to scratch their heads also. But because I think it really depends, for some questions, like, I'll just throw up again the example of a disease-focused research project. It's not clear to me that you need a swath of, for example, the US population to inform engagement for that particular project. You're much more concerned, I think, about, do you have a group of people who are familiar with that disease to be engaged with that particular project, more so than having something that represents the US population. So a different way of saying this, or a different example, is that, you know, in the United Kingdom, they have NICE, which makes decisions about the types of medicines that are covered and so on. Those decisions are informed by a citizens' council that is explicitly focused to be representative of the entire UK population. I think that's a perfect use for a sample or an engagement that's representative in that way. Because that's another question, like when we see representation on here, you have to explode the question and say, what do you mean by representativeness?
On which category?
Yeah, on which category? Or sometimes representativeness comes by a process that elects people to be representatives, whether or not they happen to look like a particular group.
So while you're answering this question, we'll do another question from the audience.
When we started the polling, I think that this was just a great example of how we can use this kind of response mechanism to make stuff up. So you asked the question, are you more conservative or progressive? You didn't say we're talking politics, but you jumped to the conclusion that we're talking politics. And I think there's some of us in the room that are getting a little bit antsy about trying to talk about engagement the way we're talking about when there's no question or discussion of relationship building. I mean, true engagement is relationship building, right? And I think Montel and some of us have been kind of simmering because, you know, this is not, you can't have true engagement without relationship. And sometimes stakeholder engagement is not the panacea. Some work that we want to do cannot be done. I mean, if you want to do stakeholder engagement, it's for certain types of research or certain types of projects, but it's, you know, trying to solve it by throwing virtual stuff at it is not necessarily the best way to go about it. And I think Matt's conversation, Matt's topic, his presentation touches to me on the real place we need to start when we're talking about engagement. Sorry, I just get really passionate about this stuff.
So can I ask, to me what you're talking at least a little bit about is the why, right? What's the purpose of the engagement? And if you aren't clear about why you're doing this, then
it's also,
I understand, but the how is determined, I would like to hope, by what it is you're trying to do, right? So I think that's what we're trying to explore today is, what are virtual platforms good for?
And it would be a question as to whether virtual platforms would support or supplement the types of relationships you think are important to engagement, right? I mean, I think that's one of the key questions. Now, there may be parts of engagement that are really well served by a virtual platform, but maybe not all. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Montel Temez, CCTSI here, Community Engagement. I think one of the things that's really stood out for me in this conversation is the idea of what engagement actually is. And what I'm hearing a lot, and what keeps striking me is this: if we're going for knowledge extraction, where all we want to do is poll somebody, or all we want to do is get their feedback on something, that's not engagement. There's no relationship there. And as Leslie mentioned before, I think there are definitely ways and instances in which a virtual platform might make a lot of sense. However, I would ask the people who are maybe representative of the group that I'm trying to study, what platform would you use? Mm-hmm. Is this the best way, do you think, to go about this? If I were asking you this question, how would you be most likely to answer? Or what tool would you be most likely to use in order to engage further? And then take it a step further and have them actually help me craft the question. Right. So that's kind of a CBPR model. And I think if you go back to that little table that you had about the different levels of engagement, there are definitely more updated versions of that.
Of the latter participation, yeah, absolutely. It's been modified. And, yeah. So
public.
But it's important to point out that this was an issue even then,
yes,
right? Where
yes, absolutely. It's not an easy answer, and as Leslie mentioned, engagement isn't the panacea. So I think you need to figure out what the intent is. To help inform what the questions might be, and then how you ask them, and whom do you ask, and how do you craft those things, and then how do you interpret and disseminate the information. And you can't, I don't think, do that super effectively if you're going for full-on engagement without actually having a representative of that group really helping you every single step of the way.
And you use the term representative, and that's just, we all use that term, and the question, right? Yeah. How do you decide who is a representative? How are they chosen? On what characteristics?
So just to underscore these last 2 points, the slide where you ask about the purposes for which virtual engagement is well suited and perhaps ideally suited, I think you need to add a question to these last 2 points. Are there purposes for which virtual engagement is not well suited?
That's right. That's a good point.
A lot of times we can't get to virtual engagement until we've already built relationships and actually talked with the community.
Matt, do you want to say anything about whether about roughly 1 in 5?
The correct answer is,
these are new.
The correct answer is C. Not sure. It's ethics, so it all depends. But this goes to the exceptionalism or non-exceptionalism concept from earlier, is this idea of what really is exceptional or not, and are these ethical issues exceptional or not? It's interesting to me that most people said no. I think if I had to choose one or the other, I would probably say no, they're not unique. They're the same ethical issues and concepts that we faced in different contexts, but now they just happen to be in the virtual setting.
Okay, so now we're going to give you a couple of policy type questions. This touches on a question that I tried to raise earlier. So Facebook, Twitter, Google have data. If they are intending to mine those data on a health-related topic, should they have to go to an IRB the way you and I would have to go to an IRB?
Just to clarify, you added something to the question. You said Facebook, Twitter, and Google are the ones doing it. Or is it just should health research in general?
You're right. Of course, I wrote these questions this morning, so they're not probably that well phrased. What I was thinking is not a health researcher, because obviously, if you want to do this, you are a covered entity. You're going to have specific requirements. I'm thinking if you work at Facebook, if you work at Google, and you want to do some analytics, say you want to find out, just to toss something out there, whether people who have a certain search term sequence later on start to have different search term sequences that suggest, a health outcome. So you're trying to predict who's going to get pancreatic cancer. And if you, search for abdominal pain and weight loss, a few months later, you're searching for treatments for pancreatic cancer. That's an interesting association. If I'm working at Google, should I have to go to the IRB for that?
And combining these data with other.
I'm not in this scenario. In this scenario, I was thinking specifically about an actual study where people at Google noticed that if you search for a certain set of terms, you are very likely later on to be searching for another set of terms, which suggested that you had a significant illness. So no names associated with this, no identifiable health information. Correct.
And they can do
yes, they have the
yeah.
right to. What? Let's go to the next question, because this, I think, is where it gets more interesting. What if they do this and find that there is an association? Should Google be required, or is there some moral obligation to tell you that you should go talk to your doctor?
I think, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, someone being Matt perhaps, but I think Facebook already, aren't there some companies that already do this, like related to suicidality? And you may not know, but.
Yes, there's some predictors that we use. If it's like an acute suicidal event, then we try to prevent that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah. Actually, I'm not totally sure. I think that we contact the authorities. I think somebody, it gets like flagged as a potential event, and then a human will review and make sure that it is what it seems to be, and then we'll contact the authorities. The police or whoever is the most appropriate official organization to deal with a acutely suicidal person. I'm not sure about the details.
That's That's what I've heard. That's what I heard the process was too.
So one of the questions I would have would be, A, how do you know that this person isn't searching on behalf of somebody else? B, how is this data going to be utilized beyond just the well-being of the individual who's providing it? But are there other algorithms that are embedded in some of this activity that could then serve ads to these people about psychiatric hospitals or whatever? I mean, there are lots of different potential issues that could arise from this that could definitely be considered ethical problems.
Yeah, I mean, maybe these are the people who should get the ad saying, do you want to get enrolled in a pancreatic cancer trial? All right, no, that's right. Okay, so if you think that they should, what's the level of certainty at which you trigger the warning? So now you've got someone who may have pancreatic cancer. If you are 3% certain, 20% certain, 50% certain, 80%, 95%, or forget this, you should never, Google should never give me a pop-up that says you might have pancreatic cancer, go talk to your doctor. Well, I think we're at least coalescing around never or damn certain. Any other thoughts on that? And this is the last one, but we were batting this around last night and said, okay, so what if your condition is an untreatable condition? You have nothing you can do about it. Does that change Google's obligation? I'm totally picking on Google here, but does that change Google's obligation? Oh, it's interesting. Okay.
Like the genetics analogy, right?
Yeah, do you want to say more about that?
Oh, no, just the same concept arose with like predictive genetic testing, right? These same concepts about duty to warn or duty to tell people about test results. And I think pretty widely accepted in that domain, if it's not treatable, most people say not to tell, not to actively warn if you've discovered a genetic mutation.
Yeah, so the difference here being most people are saying, yeah, I would want to know.
Even if it's-
or Google has the same obligation whether it's treatable or not. Okay, well, we'll be publishing all these data, I'm sure.
Without consent.
Without your consent or knowledge. Thank you.
All right.
We do have I think we have a couple more minutes, right? What's our timing?
I think we're behind now.
Oh, we're now behind time, so we'll be rushing right ahead to our next panel.
Next up is Dr. Wilkins and Dr. Grand, who are going to talk with us. They're going to help us weave it all together, which is good because I think we need some help in the weaving department.
On or not on?
Use this one. This one is on.
Okay, so I'm Consuelo Wilkins and delighted to be at the end of the day. So I'm supposed to be helping to weave it all together, and so I did take some notes. Some of them, some of my notes reflect really things that I struggled with, but others certainly comments, my ideas spurred by others. So one, I think the presentations today have been great, so thanks to everyone. I really enjoyed and appreciated Matt DeCamp's references to engagement from decades ago. Because I think one of the challenges for those of us who consider ourselves engagement scientists or engagement specialists is that now that, you know, engagement is now sexy, everybody wants to do it, and people want to think that it's something new, and it's not. And people have been doing it for a long time, and we know a lot about it, and we're concerned that some of you are messing it up. That's the weaving it all together here. And so I was asked, you know, many months ago when this was being planned to talk about coming to consensus, and then as I was putting my slides together, I realized I don't know how often I ever get people together for the purpose of consensus. Like, consensus to me is like the antithesis of engagement. So the idea of bringing people together is to understand the individual variability and the differing needs and make sure that we can accommodate all of them and make it more person-centered or individualized or personalized, not to get them to agree on something. And that, you know, this consensus kind of idea is more at the policy level. Maybe it reflects sort of structure and those things, but rarely am I bringing people together to talk about consensus, which is why I put decision-making in there instead of really focusing on consensus, because I'm not sure I can tell you how to do that the best way. I do think that there are many engagement strategies, as you're hearing today, and I think that's great. I disagree with Matt that we need a flow chart to go through and pick out which one we need for some situation. I think we need strategies to make sure that any method we're using for engagement is effective, and that we have some commonality and some common measures and metrics so that we can ensure that those engagement strategies are meeting the needs of those who are using it. I think it's really important to talk about the power balance, and I think that power balance needs to be people who have the power, resources, and influence need to be sure that they have people at the table who don't. And so usually when I'm giving a talk about engagement, I look around the room and I say, who here is from representing a community or a patient population or a stakeholder other than researchers or research enterprise or whoever has the money to put on the meeting? To put on the meeting. Whoever's in charge of the meeting. Who's not from that group of people? And if there's nobody involved in that, then there's a problem with the meeting. There's an imbalance of power, and probably the things that we're going to talk about are not the things we should be talking about. I'm going to use up all my time without getting through these slides. But I'm weaving together. Okay, and I think the sort of the last part of Matt DeCamp's discussion and bringing in the questions, looking at sort of things related to predictive analytics makes me really nervous about what we're going to call engagement. Because when we go back to that old ladder, that is manipulation. And we cannot let engagement turn into a strategy where we are following people on their apps, we're taking their click of a consent as really informed consent, and we're using their data and their behaviors, and we're following them, and we're tracking them, and we're getting them to do all the things that we want them to do to help us with our research without their real involvement, and putting a banner on it that says engagement, because it's not. So that's it. Oh, can I stop now? Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to go through these quickly because I think we hit most of them, and hopefully you're not getting dual here. Just reminding that if we're thinking about strategies for engagement, we cannot forget what we learned in the past, and that is the most engaged means that people are empowered and they are driving the decision making. They're not waiting for us to ask them questions and ask them to come to the table. This is a model of engagement that looks like some of the other ones you've seen that my team developed over the last few years. And the reason that I show it with the different engagement strategies next to it, so at the lower rung, there's more people involved, limited time, less involvement, and at the top is the most involved, longer involvement, deeply embedded into the work. And this is not to say that the engagement or the kind of involvement at the lower rung is bad or not good, but that it's different. And often when we're looking for representativeness in some ways, we have to go to a larger group of people. But almost always when I'm designing a project, I have at least 3 levels of engagement. So it's very rare that I'm in charge of a project and there's just one. So lots of different methods. I sent late in my response to Suzanne a list of more than 50 different methods of engagement. This is one where I like I'm not going to talk about the specifics of it, but I like how they go through and look at what these really mean and think about the amount of time that it takes. Because if you're doing engagement, it takes time. And if you look at this total time, that's the time for planning. So if you're not involving the stakeholders in the planning, then you should not expect that whatever you're doing in the actual engagement, real-time engagement, is of any use at all. And I think that's something that we often overlook. So of the strategies or methods, there are some newer ones that have actually been tested or used in online manners. And I think that these are important. I think as engagement is evolving, as is technology, we shouldn't be thinking about replacing one with the other, but we should be thinking about how we can leverage technology to do more high-touch engagement, so that it's working hand in hand. So it's not seen as something that's replacing the real engagement, but how can we leverage it to do engagement better? Not that it's going to do anything better than we used to do it, but that perhaps we can do some things better by combining them. That's certainly my bias. I did want to share a little bit about an engagement strategy that our team has developed called Community Engagement Studios. I just put it here so it can be in the slides, so I'm not going to go in detail through all of this, but this is a PCORnet study that we're just wrapping up, where we actually take this method of engagement and we have compared it to engaging researchers in the the work. And so the primary thing I want to show you here is, what a great looking group of folks I work with. I mean, that's pretty cool. But that we actually engage stakeholders at multiple levels. So what I talked about, stakeholder investigators being on the team, they have office space in my office. They come, they can hold meetings, they can schedule the conference room, they get on the computer, they can download whatever they want to do. They have space, they're a part of the team, and we engage them throughout. So in this study, we randomized researchers to input through a community engagement studio. I'll say a little bit more about that, versus input from researchers through a translational studio, and then we compared them. So this is just a snapshot of what we found that was different, and I added this in after hearing the earlier presentations, because what we found was that the stakeholders, these are community members and patients who are selected on the 20 different studies we talked about, they're selected based on the needs of the researcher. So if they're studying diabetes in women, then that's the group we bring to the table. If they're studying cystic fibrosis or sickle cell, that's the group we bring to the table. So, so the group does reflect the disease population or the demographic, and I think that was one of Matt's earlier points as well. So key thing is that these people can give us input throughout the research process in all these different stages, and there's some things that they're actually better at than the researchers. So community members are in blue. But what we found is that they often gave us input in the form of stories. And I mentioned that earlier, that sometimes researchers don't actually understand the stories. So I think that as we're considering how we engage virtually, we have to have a way of capturing stories in some way. And what that looks like, other people will have to figure out. But in this process of doing this PCORI study, we also created a number of different tools. This one is a tool to measure the person-centeredness of research. And so I think that one of the key reasons that we do engagement is so that the research products are more person-centered, so that we've embedded into the work the priorities, the needs, the preferences of those people that we're seeking to engage. And so this has been presented a few times. It's not published other than in the PCORI final report that's due out very soon. But this was validated with community members and researchers, so that anybody should be able to take this tool and complete it, and they can tell you how good, sorry, not good, how person-centered your research is based on that. So in our, I had the pleasure of doing work in the All of Us research program and helping to develop the pilot. And as part of that, I was charged with engaging, what would reflect eventually the 1 million people who are going to be in All of Us. And so what I did was put together this table that represents individuals who are diverse, so based on a demographic, and likely to be excluded if we didn't have some specific strategies to engage them. So people who are blind, deaf, don't have access to technology, aren't really technically adept in understanding what they needed for this program. So we went around the country and we engaged all these different people using these community engagement studios, which I realize I still haven't told you about. But these are different people that we brought to the table. So when I think about virtual engagement, I also want to make sure, are you going to be able to reach all these people that I was able to reach? So people who are homeless, people who have less than high school degree, people who speak other languages. I want to make sure you're not leaving them out. And this is, it was a busy summer. A couple of years ago, we went around the country. It's not purposeful that we excluded you here. NIH had some restrictions on where we could go initially, but we did these in-person community engagement studios in 6 months with all these people, almost half of them minorities, and they were in person, face-to-face, hour-and-a-half meetings where the key things you should know about the community engagement studio. So we identify people based on the needs of the researcher or the study. We invite them to the table. We prepare them. We give them some insights into what they should expect. We work with the researcher on developing questions that are really good questions to ask, not the questions that we wouldn't be able to answer anyway. We tell them they only have 15 minutes. They have to send us 10 slides. They send us 25 slides, and we say no, 10, a 1 and a 0. You got to take out all the acronyms. You got to make it reasonable. And along the way, we have a community member who's working with us, who's reviewing the slides, who is going to facilitate the discussion, because that person is charged with balancing the power in the room. That person is charged with being able to engage all of the participants and the community members, make them feel comfortable, and make sure that they're not using this technical language that people don't understand, or that they're inserting their own opinions about how great their own research is. So, these are strategies that we use in bringing people together. So all those 77 studios across the country, South Dakota, we took a community member with us on the road. So they traveled with us. So we had to make all of the arrangements for these sessions and meetings. So I think I'm winding down. I think it's important to emphasize some of the principles of community engagement and participant engagement that you're starting to hear and I've talked a little bit about already. And that is making sure that whatever strategy you use doesn't overlook the importance of the foundations of engagement. Balancing the power, making sure that it is inclusive, representative, based on the needs of the study. I do agree that not every study needs to be balanced with the same, reflecting the entire country. If you're doing a research study with people who have sickle cell, then that's a different demographic than a study focused on people with cystic fibrosis. So I think, those are extremes that I like to give, but it makes sense that we're looking at people who are affected by whatever we're studying. I think that often lost in these decisions about engagement are self-selection versus not. People who are eager, already involved, already online, who are going to come to answer a question, are probably not going to provide you the kind of input that you really need. Or they're just going to affirm things that you already think you know. So when you're doing this work, I think it's important to be sure you don't sacrifice quality for numbers. Make sure that you have strategies to engage a full range of people, so understanding who isn't likely to participate. So that's usually my first question. Who are we leaving behind before we get started? Because I want to know what the strategies are to make sure that we can pull those people in somehow. I think that, again, the and is that they're not just the users of the platform, but they're involved in the design of the platform, the design of the questions, the design of the exercise, that people have to be involved in every stage of that. And then I talked already about whether or not consensus is really needed, and if so, why? And if we come to some consensus, are we limiting the power of people who didn't agree? Are we actually leaving the best ideas on the table because we're forcing people to come to a consensus? And then I think we have to make sure that whatever we do, we have multiple ways of extracting or pulling in that input. We have to be able to take in the text words that are misspelled, and again, the emoticons that people want to use. And we can't force people into the ABC 1, 2, 3 options without having some context for their work. So, how did I do? Am I well over time? All right, thank you.
Grab that.
All right, so I really get the last speaking slot. So hopefully you still have a little energy left. We're gonna pivot slightly to a different question, which is a question that I think a lot about, which in my role at the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics at Penn, which is the relationship that we as researchers have with policymakers in trying to extend the reach and influence of research in the policymaking process. I know that feels like a audacious goal these days. The National Academies put out this report in 2012, really trying to urge researchers to kind of double down their efforts in thinking about how we as researchers can participate in the public policy process. And then Nicholas Kristof, back in 2014, wrote this column that I don't know how many of you saw this at the time, but really stirred the pot with a lot of academics because it included, for example, this quote, which is, "The most stinging dismissal of a point is to say, quote, that's academic." In other words, to be a scholar is often to be irrelevant. So he got a lot of researchers out there feeling pretty cranky that day and engaging in discussions on this. So the question is, to some extent, can social media help us bridge this divide between research and policy? And I should say, I don't come to this as a disciple of social media. In fact, I'm a fairly modest user myself of social media, but we do think about this a lot at the Health Policy Institute at Penn, and have done some research in this space to try to inform these efforts, which I'm going to share with you. So this first thing I'm going to explain where this data comes from first is a study we did focused very much on researchers who are engaged in health services research and health policy research. We pulled a sample of researchers who were attending the Academy Health annual research meeting and did a face-to-face research study with them. And what you see up here are results of some data where we presented a research scenario to them, and then among the individuals who participated, they were randomized to one of 3 dissemination scenarios, so they only saw one of these. And in one case, it was a traditional media strategy, which looks exactly like what you see at every academic institution around the country, involving a university press office that's tied to the release of a research study. The second was the researcher themselves engaging in some social media dissemination that led to some exposure to the research study. And the third was direct engagement with policymakers. And then we asked them a range of questions about the scenario that we just shared with them. And what you can see here, these ratings are on a 1 to 10 scale, except for the last one, is that in general, researchers in our sample thought that social media could be fairly impactful and efficacious. But when you ask them these other questions about how confident they were to do it, very low compared to the traditional media channel. Peer respect, also low. Where this fits into academic promotion, also quite low, not surprising. And then when we ask people on a 0 to 100 scale, just their overall impressions of this social media gets rated a little lower. We did ask them open-ended questions that allowed us to do some qualitative analysis. And that's not on this slide yet. Let me just show you what this, well, I'll jump ahead and come back to that. They were really nervous about engagement on social media. And these 4 things really came up. The first was the sense that the conversation on social media is a very loud and noisy conversation, and not one that they feel particularly comfortable engaging in. The second one is these high-profile stories of researchers really sticking their foot in their mouth in some way, or really getting embroiled in some controversy that they wish they could just extract themselves from. And people were very anxious about this. The third, that they just felt like they didn't really know how to use these tools very well. And the fourth, that while the previous slide showed you that I think people felt some sense that these tools could be effective, they really had no idea how. So they're very uncertain about the right way to do this. When we asked them about how they were engaged in dissemination, at least at that time, And what you see is all that blue stuff is kind of all the traditional stuff using news media and whatnot, and even direct engagement with policymakers. And less than 1 in 5 people were essentially doing this other stuff on Facebook and blogging and Twitter. Now, these data are several years old at the moment, so I have no idea what this would look like if we repeated this today. It could very well be quite different. We then went on to talk to, now of course, it takes 2 to tango, so we're interested not just in the researchers, but also the policymakers. So then we went to the National Conference of State Legislators annual meeting, and we walked around the hallways and pulled people aside to interview them. It was a combination of state elected officials and people who work for state elected officials, so their office staff. And so we were asking them about whether social media is something they were using, something they were thinking about, and also just more generally about how they would go about getting information and how they would like to go about getting information. And what was, frankly, pretty jarring for me was like the degree of cynicism and mistrust that exists not on the, so it clearly exists on the researcher side, who have a lot of really negative things to say about politicians and policymakers and money and whether people are paying attention to science. But on the legislator side, lots of mistrust about a couple issues. One is really about like both individual level biases as a researcher, institutional level conflicts of interest, institutions just wanting to go out and get another grant, and that's really not in service of the public in any way. There was so many negative things that they had to say about research. It was really somewhat alarming. The other thing that we heard a lot about was whether or not research can be useful in the policymaking process, and that when researchers often even do that direct engagement with policymakers, they often come to, quote, educate the policymaker, which is not what the policymaker is really looking for. They don't view themselves as a student of you as a researcher. What they're looking for is relevant and timely information that's related to a decision that they need to make sometime in the not so distant future, like maybe in the next week. You know, it has been written about for years and years about these two communities of researchers and policymakers and all the difficulties of bringing them together. And at least when we were doing this, it was alive and well. So we then went on to look at whether or not social media might be creating some linkages that could be leveraged to connect these networks of researchers and make direct linkages to policymakers. So we did a study looking at congressional staff and whether or not, and these were staff that had some sort of health-related responsibility within their portfolio, and looked at their top health sources on Twitter. And what you see here is all these Twitter handles that are in red are largely all information sources that are connected to the news media. So they may be health-specific sources connected to the news media. So the top one up there is Sarah Cliff. She used to write for the Washington Post. She's now at Vox.com, not Fox, Vox with a V. And she writes a lot about the Affordable Care Act and implementation and all sorts of issues. So she was the top health source on Twitter. And then you see a bunch of things below her which are largely Twitter handles that are connected to some sort of official government agencies, roles, congressional committees, and things along those lines. And then you get down here and you have the health-specific handles for the New York Times, The Hill, which is a political focus paper in Washington, NPR, Wall Street Journal, and then Jen Haberkorn, who writes for Politico, also has a health-specific focus, and then the Kaiser Health News. And you might notice on here that there are no academic researchers on there, okay? And the only journal that's actually on here is Health Affairs, which is down here with a whopping 7 followers. So you'll also see by looking at this list that even the top of the list, that there was only 26 out of, I think we had about 150 health staff that we were looking at here who had public Twitter handles that we could find on Twitter. When you looked at all the sources overall. So health was this like tiny, tiny little slice of who they were following on Twitter, like handles that we could code to being health specific. What you'll see is there's a lot more individuals than organizations followed on Twitter. And they, again, tend to fall into the news media category and the political governmental category, which is a combination of official government agencies and elected officials, kind of all fall into that category. And of the, you could see well over 1,000 Twitter handles. There was a total of 26 that were academic. So Twitter is not exactly fostering all these new and robust connections between these worlds. We, this past summer, did a survey of state legislators. So these were all elected officials, not staff again. And one of the questions, there's a whole bunch of things focused on Medicaid policies, but one of the things we asked them here was about where they generally go to get information. And social media is way, way down on the bottom of this list. Now, this is not meant to tell you that this is a horrible idea to do. I'm not here to like throw cold water on the idea of using social media, because clearly a lot has changed in the past year and all of this might be different. But is it worth it? And so we as an institute do actually invest a fair amount of effort in our endeavors to reach policymakers in social media. Clearly, what we've learned both at Penn and through that work I showed you is that while researchers are gradually coming on board to using social media for this purpose, that in general, most researchers are still slow to adopt these technologies and still have a lot of anxieties about how much of a social media presence they truly want to foster. And the second big conclusion, again, is that I don't think social media is really disrupting information channels, but it is potentially supercharging certain information channels and creating new ways to get information perhaps traveling more quickly, probably still traveling through the same channels it was going through before. There are clearly trusted intermediaries that are really important for policymakers. And I don't think that those trusted intermediaries are rapidly changing in any way. There are some rare examples, I think, and those on Twitter will know this, of some folks affiliated with academia, researchers who've developed a very large profile on social media, and in some sense have come to fill that role a little bit as the intermediary transmitting information from academia to journalists often, and journalists then often become a channel to get to policymakers. So as an institution, again, why we've invested in this, we're still, see good reasons to do this. As an institute, as opposed to individual researchers, we are more willing to generalize, whereas researchers are often really reluctant to say anything beyond the results of their individual studies. We help researchers overcome their fear of self-promotion, which many still are fearful of, believe it or not. That fear of getting something wrong that researchers have, I think we can overcome that as an institute. And then again, a lot of, particularly junior faculty see this as a distraction when they're, on the train of trying to get promoted. It is a challenge. So it's important to keep in mind all these discussions of social media platforms, they are fundamentally social communities that form. And when you as an organization, whether it be a research study, whether it be an institute, whether it be a university, you're operating at a little bit of a disadvantage on social media platforms because you don't often have a personality. So one of the challenges is to develop a personality on social media because that is part of the social engagement that happens on these platforms. A key value of social media is that it is much more responsive to the policy cycle than the research cycle, okay? So one of the things that our university press offices are really good at is you have a publication coming out, there's an embargoed press release that gets all prepared, and they have a very good media relations strategy to get that in the hands of journalists and try to maximize news coverage in the 48 hours after your study gets published. But what they're terrible at is actually republicizing research results at a time that it's important and relevant. And that is something that social media can really supercharge in terms of giving life to old research at a time where it can be much more impactful. So this is a funny tweet from Michael McWilliams, a faculty member at Harvard, where he talks, you can see the tweet up there, the causal effect on page views of Harvard economists tweeting a link to an article 4 months after publication. So I don't actually know what this article was. I was trying to go back and find it. No idea what it's about, but he's pointing out how essentially David Cutler and Amitabh Chandra tweeted out about his research that had been published 4 months prior, and then he went on the journal and looked at his page views for that and saw this big spike, much more than, prior to that it had been like 1 to 3 people per day. So, there's some models, I think, that a lot of researchers have in their mind about how research is supposed to impact policy. And some of these were written about, I'm not going all the way back to the 60s. This one is the 1970s from Carol Weiss. And one of the models is a knowledge-driven model where I think a lot of researchers have this in their mind, that they will do the formative research and then that will lead to someone realizing that a policy needs to be written based on the research, and then the policy gets implemented. And so it's a very linear process. There's another one that Carol Weiss wrote about, which is a problem-solving model that I think a lot of researchers kind of tune into as their way of thinking about how this works, which is that we all agree that there's some problem to solve, and then the policymakers are supposed to look over at the researchers and say, what's the answer in terms of how we solve this problem? And the researchers have done all this great research and said, here's the answer, okay, go do that. But the reality is that research matters a lot through all sorts of phases of policymaking. And in particular, I think researchers often fail to appreciate these parts up in the top right corner, which is where research helps get a problem on the policy agenda in the first place, just by recognizing that a problem exists and the problem warrants some sort of policy intervention. Research can also matter a lot in terms of thinking about what kinds of options exist to potentially solve that problem. And then all the way in the top left, research matters a lot in terms of thinking about the impacts of policies and feeding that back into the policymaking cycle. So this idea that there's this really linear process that starts with research, ends with policy implementation, I think is often a misguided one. Now, one other word of caution is that I think that there's at least some who talk about, particularly with junior faculty, like, you should do this because it can increase your citations and there's an alignment of interest here that you're not seeing. There's not really a good answer to this question yet, but the journal Circulation several years ago took all their articles that were being published and actually randomized them to a social media dissemination strategy in addition to the usual stuff versus just sticking with the usual stuff, to look at what happened with citations over time. Or not citations, but page views of the original research article at Circulation, and found no difference between the two. So I don't know that they went back and looked at citations, but citations can actually take a long time, of course, to track. So some challenges, that we've observed ourselves is that, a lot of times you put a tremendous amount of work into generating translation material that you're going to push out on social media, and that can be pretty time consuming, and you go ahead and do it and it's crickets, right? So there's many times where you may invest a lot of resources with not a lot of success, but then you may have other times where you have pretty big wins. As I mentioned, a lot of reticence still amongst faculty today, despite the fact that I think that 15% on Twitter would be higher than that now. It is hard to break through the noise, right? So social media is a very noisy discussion, and it's one that changes rapidly from day to day. And it can be hard and unpredictable when you're trying to penetrate into that about what you're going to be competing with. Social media does mean that researchers become much more publicly available and out there in many ways. And so researchers have to be comfortable with that role. We as an institute have had to become more comfortable with that role. And then lastly, impact is still really hard to measure. in this work, and we don't have a good way of doing that yet, other than, in fact, most of our perceptions about impact don't come from, Twitter-specific metrics. They come more from the qualitative aspect of this, about who the key influencers are that you feel you're reached in any particular dissemination strategy. So, I'll just end with these last couple comments, which is, I think if you look back at the literature around translation and dissemination and knowledge transfer, it's been a finding for a long time that trusted intermediaries matter a lot in terms of linking these worlds together. And I think that still very much holds true on social media, though again, these networks I think are somewhat supercharged. And I think where social media really does excel is it being timely, relevant, and issue focused, and being much more cognizant of the policy's life cycle as opposed to thinking about the research life cycle. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions.
Is it on now? Yep. Okay. So I guess a question for both of you. One of the old sayings from Washington for a long time has been that you can show up in front of legislators and provide them data, and they may or may not understand and pay attention. But if you show up with a patient who has a condition, who tells them their stories, you get your bill or you get your funding. Wouldn't it be interesting to begin to pair the notion of telling a story with the research that supports that as a mechanism to leverage policy in the future?
I would say yes, and I think some people are already starting to do that. So when I took my health policy course a few years ago now, the training was, it's got to be one page and there's got to be a story that starts off, or no one's going to pay attention to it. I think a lot of people are thinking carefully about how to incorporate stories into not just policy-related discussions, but also into disseminating their research results.
I would agree. It is quite clear that narrative is like an extremely effective delivery mechanism. And, that goes back to, the beginnings of time. I mean, we tell stories, and that's how people remember things. And there is good research to show that when you package findings in the form of a story, it's not just policymakers that are more responsive, it's everybody. In fact, one of the faculty at Penn that I work with has done a lot of studies looking at the use of narrative to convey information, and has done that with physicians as well. So trying to get physicians to adopt a practice guideline. The typical method is to send out the practice guideline and say, this is what you're supposed to be doing. And he randomized physicians to packaging that practice guideline as a story versus the traditional guideline, and shows much greater uptake when giving it as a story. So it's not just those naive policymakers.
Just a quick comment on that. With the community engagement core of the CCTSI here at university, we actually have a workshop called Beyond the Publishable Paper, taking your data and making a story out of it, and can tailor that to different groups. We've done it with some community members before, and that work with researchers, and so that's a resource here.
Other questions? Especially among the silent of you?
I would also just point out one other issue that comes up with the use of stories. So one of the classes I teach at Penn is with our fellows, who are all, in post-residency period, developing their research careers. And one of the things I talk about in the health policy class is dissemination tools. We end up talking about all these techniques, and the question inevitably comes up, like, isn't there a dangerous side to all of this? Like, you can tell lots of stories and convince lots of people of all sorts of things that may not in fact be true. And so there's there are ways that stories can be dangerous, because stories can convince people that anecdote is good evidence. And in fact, we want the anecdotes we use to be driven by rigorous evidence to underlie them. And so the message I always try to deliver is tell the story, but be prepared to stand up in front of a group of your peers and be really comfortable standing behind that story as delivering a message that is based on rigorous evidence, because it is a very slippery slope.
So we're really landing on some of the tenets of engagement as being relational and stories and involving participants from the beginning to the end. And we haven't said how that can be done through the use of social media, and can it be done? And what would be an example of how you could use it in a way that would really adhere to what we're talking about when what I think we've landed on this afternoon and what we're talking about in community engagement, stakeholder engagement.
So I'm not aware of an example in which social media alone was the platform for engaging stakeholders from the beginning. I do think that and maybe others can convince me that this is not true, but I think that at some level in the engagement rung, you have to have a relationship with people that is beyond what you would get on social media. And so here's where I would turn the question back to you. Are there researchers that you could partner with from beginning to end on a grant, and you only communicated with them via social media? So you found them on social media, you got their input from day one and how to design the project, all the way through conducting this research through dissemination. And the only way that you connected with them ever was in social media. And so I think if you can show me how to do that, then maybe we can figure out how to do that with community members and patients and other stakeholders. But I think even in that process, you have to think about what you lose. When I reflect on one of the slides earlier where the chocolate is covering the peanut butter and turns into this, nice, piece of candy, it's the value covering the data. And I think if we're thinking about the value of the data to people, then we're missing that the people need to be valued as part of the engagement. That if there really is some bi-directionality, then we value the input that people bring, we value the resources, we value their lived experiences, we value all of those things, and we don't just try and convince them that the data is of value. There has to be some give-get there.
So just to underscore that point, I mean, one of the major take-homes I think I've heard out of this conference is that virtual engagement is one among many approaches to engagement, will never replace face-to-face relational engagement. And where it works best and for which purposes, I think, are open questions we still have to grapple with.
Yes, I hesitate to say never, because we never know what's around the bend. So, we certainly know that for some demographics to engage in discussions around health on Facebook, they may be less likely to do it in comments, but if we organize a Facebook Live event, they may join in and listen because they do see people and they hear voices, and some aspects of conveying realness and maybe appearing trustworthy can be overcome by that actual visual audio piece that is part of this social media platform. So again, I'm not sure if that ever replaces the face-to-face, but I think in some ways that is an in-between that allows some of those relational pieces to be included.
And I will say at the Academy Health meeting, which I go to every year, these Twitter networks that exist of people in the health policy world that they've never seen each other face to face, and all of a sudden they're like, I know you. So that face to face deepens that relationship.
I was having a similar reflection, which is I do have people that I only know on Twitter whom I consider to be trustworthy sources of new information. And I'm not sure if that means that engagement is deep and meaningful in a real relationship or not, because I don't actually know them. But I've followed them for some amount of time, and we've actually communicated. So it is bi-directional at some level. It's become bi-directional. And I guess the thing I was kind of reflecting on is I think, David, you may be the first person today who's really gone away from patient and community engagement to some of the other stakeholders. And it did start me wondering about the roles or capacities of these tools, these platforms, for approaching payers, for approaching clinical communities, professional associations, policymakers, and are there, we're all human beings, so the relational, bi-directional stuff is probably still important no matter what. But is there a special role for these platforms, or could there be in these other communities where it's just, at least at the moment, not really gonna work for someone who comes to the health enterprise with some level of mistrust, let's say. And you're just not gonna garner new trust by connecting with someone on Facebook or Twitter. I don't know,
Yeah,
I'm just wondering.
When I teach anything about policy, I always talk about policy is everywhere. This focus was on public policy, elected officials, getting made in legislative settings. But there's many more opportunities for research to influence the decision-making within private organizations that have enormous impact on healthcare delivery. And there are, one of the things that Twitter has is all these micro communities that form around people who have highly specialized interests, meaning like I'm personally interested or I'm a stakeholder who is economically interested in this. And, we've tried to, so those are important communities to tap into. And oftentimes it's a matter of finding out who are some of the key influencers in that world that you want to share your work with, share your findings with, and get them to push that out in their network. And it's been remarkable where we will see some research products really light up on social media in entirely new communities that we are not connected to, but it's because someone in our network can push that into that other network and it will light up. And so we're always, every month we review analytics on our blog posts and things that like hit on Twitter and whatnot. And I'd say more than half the time you're like, oh, that one, and so you just don't know. A funny story was one that was a research study done at Penn that had to do with trauma systems. And somebody wrote a paper that had to do with like, they created, I don't remember the details, but they created a map of the US and like your proximity to a trauma center if something bad happened to you. And suddenly, like somehow that got out on social media, and it was like became part of people's vacation planning about like whether or not you were near or far from a trauma center. And there was another one that had to do with something having to do with motorcycles, and it got like into the Harley world on social media. And also, so there are all sorts of ways that there are networks that none of us may be a part of, that if you can crack into them. And we'll often ask our researchers now, like, who are stakeholders who would be interested in this paper? and make a list for us. And then we'll go out and do a little digging to see whether we can think about how to crack that network a little bit.
That in our Mid-South Clinical Data Research Network, I oversee stakeholder engagement for the patients, community, and the clinicians. And when we started it, it's coming here. It's coming for me. The clinicians. So when we started the CDRN, we did 5,000 surveys with community members. We did community engagement studios with 75 community members. We have 12 community members on our stakeholder engagement board, and we have 2 on the team. So that same sort of rung. We planned to have 500 clinician surveys and 100 clinician interviews, and 4 of them on our stakeholder engagement team advisory group. And they were much more challenging to engage than the patients and the community members. So creating the value proposition for clinicians is much different. I think whereas, we certainly don't want to say communities are, easier to come to some common ground and ideas around but certainly clinicians, they want individualized value propositions. They're demanding about them. And I think if we're thinking about how to engage clinicians on social media, I think that's going to be challenging in many ways, in that they're probably not forming the same kind of communities that other stakeholders are forming. And I might be wrong about that, but that's our experience, yeah.
I could make some snarky comments like that, but they're used to getting paid to engage on social media, maybe.
Exactly. That's true.
Here.
Sorry.
Just one quick comment, really, and maybe I'd like to get your thoughts about this. But how, one of the things that we see a lot are people sort of confusing marketing with engagement and vice versa. So how, Consuelo, do you go about educating your folks, who work in your circles about that? And then also just wanted to make a quick plug for another resource here within the CCTSI. We also have a program modeled closely after the Vanderbilt program in the studios. So we do have community consults available for people who are interested in doing research in community, and Leslie's part of that group. So is Marilyn. So just wanted to let you all know that.
So I think that's a very important point. Over the years, community engagement has, again, become sexier, and people have stopped saying outreach, and now they say engagement, when they still really mean outreach. They still really mean they're only going to be sharing information with people. There's no bidirectionality planned. And so this has been really challenging, both in all forms of really information sharing and print and social media. It's the same thing. People have started to use the word engagement when they really mean marketing or information sharing. And it's been a challenge. It's one that I think has been at the forefront of some of the work we've been doing with the All of Us research program, which is, has some really great communications people in there, Hollywood producer kind of people there. Kathleen may have been, interacting with some of these, but they are creating personas, and the idea that this is going to be flashy and mobile trucks to share messaging. And one thing that I think has been really clear is that we can work very hard to get a message right. And get patient or community input on it to make sure that it is inclusive, that we're going to be able to reach people who, important words in there that will reach people and let them know we want them to come to the table. Like being clear that it's free, is not important to everybody. But to some people who might be worried they're going to show up and hit a button and be asked to pay something, it's important to say that it's free. So we can do all this work and engage all these people, and then the communications marketing people get a hold of it, and they put in words that are fancy but non-substantive. They take out new and they put revolutionary. They take out it's free because they think people should presume that it's free, and then all of a sudden now we have a very short message that only a certain demographic of people are going to respond to, and I think that kind of superficial, those superficial changes in language and communication are again the opposite of engagement, and will make people feel as if they're not welcome.
Other questions? I actually have a question, but I don't want to leapfrog over anybody. So it's for either of you, but it keys off, David, your presentation especially, and it relates to some of the, I forget the modifier you used when you did your research with legislators and their staff about how they viewed researchers, that were biased and that kind of thing. And so it made me think about some work that I've done with state legislators in various places, and the importance of, so part of the challenge you're working on, right, is getting research evidence to policymakers. So how we frame that data and how we package that data matters a lot, right, for all the reasons you found. But sometimes the barrier are value-based, right? I mean, in other words, the data just doesn't matter how good the data is, how well it's packaged, how bite-sized it is, how relevant in the moment it is. It doesn't fit with what policymakers want to do. It doesn't fit with their preferences and their priorities. So what is your thinking about that in the work that you've been doing? What the role of values, social values and individual values as barriers to getting evidence in the policymaking process?
Yeah, that's a tough question. The reality is that research isn't going to fundamentally change the political belief systems that people enter into a conversation. Often, I think research can sometimes come into play in terms of bringing greater visibility to a problem that needs to be solved. The solutions that get developed to that problem are often heavily influenced by people's views on roles of government. But there are ways that research can, I think, bring exposure and visibility to issues that sometimes can yield results in unexpected ways. But it is a tough barrier to overcome, and data is not going to change people's underlying beliefs. Now, I do think that it doesn't mean we shouldn't be continuing to push, because again, there are many unexpected moments, I think, that come along where like we wouldn't be, even if you think about, obviously like what the menu of policy options is changing right now on a daily basis. But I think I feel comfortable saying that, for example, like the way that some discussions on substance abuse policy, for example, like have changed at a very rapid rate in this country, that would not have been possible not that long ago, and where research can have an impact. Now, it's not to say that there's not a lot of misguided policy discussions about substance abuse, but things are on the table that were not that long ago. Yeah.
So I'm just noting that we are 1 minute over time, and did you have a question? Do you want to close this off, Matt, as our hostess with the...
I'll just say thank you to both of you. Really terrific way to wrap up, and to everyone who stuck it out all the way to the end. Very much appreciate your attention. I think our team has some work to do at this point to try and figure out, whether there are important next steps that we could take based on what we've learned today. We will certainly put together a set of proceedings from this symposium and make those available to everyone who's been here. I feel like we've kind of just touched on a few of the possible ways in which Social media might be potentially kind of a little useful here and there, but not everywhere. And so it may be that the next thing for us to do is, you know, something that we were talking about last night, which is just start putting together a library, basically, of where social media has been used to try and touch one stakeholder